Before the first cannon fired, before the first battlefield filled with smoke, a nation had already been at war with itself for generations. Welcome, and thank you for being here tonight. Find a comfortable place. Let the day fall away from you, and allow yourself to drift gently into tonight's story. Before we begin, leave me a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from. I always love reading your messages and seeing the many places these quiet journeys reach. And if these stories help you unwind, rest, and drift asleep, please subscribe. Over 90% of the people who listen are not subscribed, and that small action makes a huge difference. It helps support the channel, and it truly encourages me to keep making more long, immersive history stories like this one. Tonight's journey is into the Civil War, a story of slavery, freedom, division, and the slow unraveling of a country that could no longer escape the conflict at its heart. So breathe deeply, settle in, and let the story carry you into the night. Before the Civil War became smoke over battlefields and telegrams carrying lists of the dead, before cannon fire rolled across Charleston Harbor and boys in blue and grey marched into a storm, neither side truly understood. The conflict had already been living for generations inside the United States. It lived in tobacco fields and rice swamps, in cotton rows stretching to distant tree lines, in northern counting houses and southern plantations, in courtrooms and churches, in speeches and silences. It lived in the contradiction at the nation's heart, a republic founded in the language of liberty that had also bound millions of human beings in chains. To tell the story of the Civil War accurately, it is not enough to begin in 1861. The war did not burst suddenly out of nowhere, as if by accident or misunderstanding. It came out of a long and bitter struggle over slavery, power, labor, race, and the meaning of freedom itself. It came from decades in which Americans argued not only over what kind of country they had built, but over whether two fundamentally different social orders could survive under one flag. In the South, slavery was not a side issue or a fading remnant. By the 19th century, it had become the foundation of a vast economic system. Enslaved men, women, and children were bought, sold, inherited, mortgaged, rented out, punished, separated, and worked under compulsion. Their labor made possible the wealth of plantation agriculture, first in tobacco and rice, then with staggering force in cotton. After Eli Whitney's cotton gin made short staple cotton profitable on a vast scale in the 1790s, slavery expanded rather than declined. The invention did not reduce the need for labor, it increased the demand for it. Cotton moved westward into Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas, and enslaved people were forced to move with it. By the mid-19th century, cotton had become the country's leading export, and much of the world's textile industry depended on its production. In that sense, slavery was not merely a southern institution. It was tied to global commerce, northern finance, and national prosperity. But for the enslaved, there was no abstraction in any of this. There was the auction block. There was the lash. There was the dread of sale and separation. There was work begun before daylight, fields under crushing heat, cabins crowded and poor, legal power resting almost entirely with the enslaver. There were marriages the law did not protect. There were children who could be taken. There were bodies treated as property and lives controlled in intimate and brutal detail. Enslaved people resisted in ways large and small, by preserving family ties, by practicing religion, by learning in secret, by slowing work, breaking tools, running away, or, in some cases, rising in open rebellion. Every plantation was built not on peace, but on force, surveillance, and fear. Southern whites did not all experience slavery in the same way. A relatively small percentage of white Southerners owned large numbers of enslaved people, and the wealthiest planters held extraordinary social and political influence. Many white families owned no slaves at all. Yet slavery still shaped the entire society around them. Poor and middling whites often aspired to own enslaved laborers one day, or at least accepted the racial order slavery created. That order gave even the poorest white man a status above any black person, enslaved or free. Southern political leaders defended slavery not only as profitable, but as natural, moral, and essential. Over time, what had once sometimes been described as a regrettable necessity hardened into a militant ideology. Slaveholders and their defenders came to insist that slavery was a positive good, beneficial alike to master and enslaved, and sanctioned by history, religion, and supposedly by science. In the North, slavery gradually weakened after the American Revolution, though it did not disappear overnight and was not absent from the nation's economy or prejudices. Northern states moved in different ways and at different speeds toward abolition. Yet racial equality did not follow. Many white Northerners opposed slavery's spread while still holding deeply racist views. Many did not want African Americans as neighbors, co-workers, or voters. Some believed slavery was morally evil. Others saw it as degrading free labor. Still, others feared the political dominance of the South. What united many Northern critics of slavery was not always a shared belief in full human equality, but an alarm over the growing power of slaveholders in the federal government and Western territories. This tension had been present from the beginning. When the Constitution was written in 1787, the delegates did not solve the issue of slavery. They buried it inside compromise. The 3/5 clause gave slaveholding states increased representation by counting enslaved people as part of the population for congressional apportionment, even though those people had no political rights. The Constitution protected the continuation of the Atlantic slave trade for 20 years, until 1808. It also required the return of fugitive slaves. The nation's founding document, like the nation itself, carried liberty and bondage side by side. That compromise held the Union together, but it also ensured that conflict over slavery would continue. In 1820, the Missouri Crisis revealed how dangerous that conflict had become. When Missouri sought admission to the Union as a slave state, fierce arguments broke out in Congress over whether slavery would be allowed to expand into the Louisiana Purchase territory. The compromise that followed admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, preserving the balance in the Senate, while drawing a line across the remaining Louisiana territory, above which slavery would be barred, except in Missouri itself. It calmed the immediate dispute, but only temporarily. Americans had not settled the question. They had postponed it. As the United States expanded westward, the issue returned again and again with greater force. Every new territory raised the same explosive question. Would slavery go there too? Beneath that question lay another, still larger one. Which section would shape the nation's future? Southern leaders understood that if free states gained permanent dominance in Congress, slavery might eventually be restricted, weakened, and placed on the road to extinction. Northern critics increasingly believed that a slave power, a small but powerful class of Southern planters, had bent the federal government to its interests for too long. Each side came to fear the other not simply as a rival, but as an existential threat. Religion sharpened the struggle. In the early 19th century, waves of evangelical revival encouraged moral reform movements in the North, including abolitionism. Abolitionists were a minority, but they were a fierce and vocal one. Men like William Lloyd Garrison denounced slavery in absolute terms, calling it a sin and a national disgrace that must end immediately, not gradually, not eventually, but at once. Frederick Douglass, who had escaped slavery himself, became one of the most powerful voices in America, speaking and writing with force about the cruelty of bondage and the hypocrisy of a republic that celebrated freedom while holding millions as property. Harriet Tubman risked her life repeatedly helping enslaved people escape through the loose network of safe houses and allies known as the Underground Railroad. Formerly enslaved people and free black activists did not merely join the anti-slavery movement, they gave it some of its deepest moral authority. Southern defenders of slavery answered in equally strong language. They turned to the Bible, to classical history, to racial theories, to property rights, to constitutional argument. They insisted that abolitionists were fanatics who threatened not only Southern wealth, but social order itself. They warned of race war, collapse, and chaos. They argued that the federal government had no right to interfere with slavery in the states where it already existed. More and more, Southern elites grew convinced that criticism of slavery anywhere could become an attack on slavery everywhere. The Mexican-American War, fought from 1846 to 1848, added a vast new layer to the crisis. The United States gained enormous Western territories, and immediately the question returned: would slavery be permitted there? The Wilmot Proviso, introduced in Congress in 1846, proposed banning slavery in any territory acquired from Mexico. It never became law, but its significance was immense. It made plain that sectional conflict over slavery's expansion was no passing quarrel. The Compromise of 1850 tried once more to hold the nation together. California entered as a free state. The slave trade, though not slavery itself, was ended in the District of Columbia. The territories of Utah and New Mexico were organized under the principle later called popular sovereignty, meaning settlers would decide for themselves whether slavery would be allowed. And crucially, Congress passed a harsher Fugitive Slave Act. That law outraged many in the North. It required citizens to assist in the capture of escaped enslaved people and denied the accused basic legal protections. Free black people, too, could be seized and carried south on the word of claimants. Federal power was now being used openly in free states to support slavery. People who had once been willing to ignore the institution at a distance now saw it advancing into their own communities through courts, marshals, and armed enforcement. Resistance grew. Some northern states passed personal liberty laws to obstruct enforcement. Crowds sometimes formed to rescue captured fugitives. the sectional divide widened. Literature entered the fight as well. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel that exposed slavery's human cruelty to an enormous readership. It was sentimental, dramatic, and shaped by its own limitations, yet its impact was undeniable. It helped many Northern readers imagine slavery not as an abstract political issue, but as a system of families broken, bodies punished, and souls wounded. In the South, many denounced it as slander. That reaction itself showed how charged the subject had become. Then came the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, one of the most consequential pieces of legislation in American history. Proposed by Senator Stephen A. Douglas, it organized the territories of Kansas and Nebraska and allowed settlers there to decide the slavery question by popular sovereignty. In effect, it repealed the old Missouri Compromise line that had barred slavery north of 36 degrees 30 minutes in much of the Louisiana Purchase. The result was fury. Northerners, who had accepted earlier compromises, now believed the South was reaching for more territory than ever before. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers poured into Kansas, and violence followed. Ballot boxes were stuffed, towns raided, homes burned, people murdered. Bleeding Kansas was a warning of the future, politics failing, militias rising, and Americans killing one another over slavery before the Civil War had even officially begun. The party system that had once managed sectional conflict began to collapse. The Whig Party broke apart. In its place, a new Republican Party emerged in the mid-1850s, united primarily by opposition to the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. Republicans did not initially demand immediate abolition in the South, where the federal government's power was limited, but they insisted that slavery must not spread. Their argument was both moral and political. They believed Western lands should be reserved for free labor, for small farmers and wage earners, not for plantation slavery. To slaveholders, however, this position was intolerable. If slavery could not expand, they feared, it would eventually be cornered, weakened, and destroyed. The same years saw one of the darkest Supreme Court decisions in American history. In 1857, the court handed down its ruling in Dred Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott, an enslaved man, had sued for his freedom on the grounds that he had lived in free territory. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney's opinion declared that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, could not be citizens of the United States, and therefore had no standing to sue in federal court. The decision also declared that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories, effectively striking at the core of Republican policy. To many in the North, this confirmed the fear that the federal government had fallen under the control of pro-slavery forces. To many in the South, it seemed a vindication of constitutional principle. Instead of settling the controversy, the ruling intensified it. Meanwhile, the enslaved continued to bear the deepest burden. Histories of politics and law can sometimes make it seem as though the nation argued about slavery in abstraction, as though the issue were lines on a map and speeches in a chamber. But slavery was, every day, lived by millions whose lives were constrained by violence and law. Families created what stability they could under constant threat. Communities preserved memory and culture across generations of captivity. Faith sustained many. So did hope. though hope itself could be dangerous. To dream of freedom under slavery was to live with longing sharpened by risk. By the late 1850s, compromise was becoming less believable. Each attempt to quiet the conflict had instead enlarged it. The nation had expanded, but its politics had narrowed into mutual suspicion. Northerners saw a slave system demanding ever more federal protection and territorial growth. Southerners saw a northern movement rising that aimed, whether gradually or quickly, to destroy the foundation of their society. Enslaved African Americans understood with painful clarity that the argument concerned not theory, but life, death, family, body, and future. The Union still stood, trains ran, Congress met, newspapers printed speeches, ships loaded cotton, churches rang bells, and courts issued rulings beneath an unbroken flag. Yet under that appearance of continuity, something essential was cracking. The old language of compromise still existed, but less and less conviction stood behind it. Politicians still use the vocabulary of balance, but the moral and political center would not hold. Too much had been said, too much feared, too much suffered. The question could no longer be contained by lines on a map or formulas in legislation. The issue was whether a nation half slave and half free could endure in that condition, or whether one system would have to yield to the other. And so the Civil War began long before the first official shot, in the long making of an irreconcilable conflict. It began in the auction yard and the cotton field, in congressional bargains and courtroom decrees, in runaway paths through dark woods, in revival tents and abolitionist newspapers, in Southern defenses of mastery and Northern anger at slaveholder power. It began in the widening distance between two sections that shared a constitution, but not a future they could both accept. By 1860, the storm was close enough that many could hear it, even if they still hoped it might pass. By 1860, the United States was still one nation on paper, but in feeling, imagination, and political trust, it was becoming two. The old compromises that had once held the Union together now seemed exhausted, like boards bent too many times and beginning at last to crack. In the North, many people had come to believe that the spread of slavery had to be stopped if the Republic was to remain true to any honest idea of freedom. In the South, many slaveholders and their political allies had become convinced that any serious restriction on slavery's growth was not simply a disagreement about policy, but the beginning of their destruction. The argument was no longer only about what slavery was. It was about whether a nation could continue when one part of it saw slavery as the foundation of social order, and another increasingly saw it as a moral wrong and a political danger. At the center of this gathering storm stood Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln had not appeared suddenly from nowhere, though to many Americans, he still seemed an unlikely figure to become the nation's most consequential president. He had been born in poverty in Kentucky, raised in Indiana and Illinois, shaped by labor, study, and ambition. He was a lawyer, a politician, a man of great patience and plain speech, capable of humor and melancholy in equal measure. He did not begin as an abolitionist in the radical sense. He did not call, in 1860, for immediate federal destruction of slavery where it already existed. Yet he believed slavery was wrong. He believed it should not expand. and he understood more clearly than many of his contemporaries that the Republic could not remain permanently divided between freedom and bondage without being transformed by that division. His rise had been marked above all by the debates of 1858 with Stephen A. Douglas during the Illinois Senate race. Douglas defended popular sovereignty, the idea that settlers in a territory should decide for themselves whether slavery would be allowed. Lincoln challenged him with a deeper warning. A house divided against itself, he said, could not stand. He did not mean the Union would collapse at once, nor that the nation would instantly become all one thing or all the other. But he believed the country was moving toward a crisis in which slavery would either be placed back on the path to extinction or become legalized and protected more broadly than ever before. Lincoln lost that Senate race, but his arguments carried across the country. He began to be seen as a leading voice of the Republican Party. The election of 1860 came at a moment when the national political structure had nearly broken apart. The Democratic Party, once one of the few institutions with real strength in both North and South, split along sectional lines. Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas. Southern Democrats, unwilling to trust Douglas after his conflicts with pro-slavery interests, chose John C. Breckinridge, who stood more openly for federal protection of slavery in the territories. A fourth candidate, John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party, tried to appeal to voters who wanted to preserve the Union by avoiding the slavery question as much as possible. The Republicans nominated Lincoln, whose platform opposed the expansion of slavery, but promised not to interfere with it in states where it already existed. This mattered enormously. Southern fire-eaters, the most militant defenders of secession, claimed that Lincoln's election would put a hostile power in control of the federal government. To many of them, it did not matter that Lincoln denied any intention to abolish slavery immediately in the states. The deeper issue was that the South would no longer dominate national politics as it once had. A president could now be elected without carrying the South at all. Slaveholding leaders saw in that fact a future in which they would be a permanent minority, unable to protect or expand the institution on which they believed their wealth and social order depended. Lincoln won the election in November 1860 with a clear electoral majority. Though less than a majority of the popular vote, he carried no southern state. His support came overwhelmingly from the North. To many white Southerners, especially in the Deep South, this confirmed their worst fears. They would be governed by a president they had not voted for, representing a party they considered fundamentally hostile to their interests, and more importantly, to slavery itself. It is essential to be precise here. While secessionists use language about constitutional rights, political liberty, and resistance to Northern aggression, the central issue driving their action was slavery. Their speeches, declarations, and later the documents of seceding states made this plain. They feared slavery's restriction, slavery's weakening, slavery's eventual destruction. They did not leave the Union over tariffs or abstract theory alone. They left because they believed the election of Lincoln endangered a slaveholding republic. South Carolina moved first. It had long been among the most ardent defenders of state sovereignty and slavery, and many of its leaders had spoken for years as if secession were both a right and a necessity. In December 1860, a convention in Charleston voted unanimously to dissolve the state's union with the United States. The language was formal and solemn, but beneath it was the excitement of men who believed history had at last reached their hour. Church bells rang, crowds cheered, and processions filled the streets. Yet behind the celebration lay a terrible decision. A state had claimed the right to leave the Union on its own authority. If the federal government denied that right, then conflict would become likely. If it accepted it, then the Union itself might unravel state by state. Other states of the Deep South soon followed. Mississippi seceded in January 1861, then Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. In each state, there were debates, divisions, hesitations. Not every white Southerner welcomed secession. Some feared war, some doubted the wisdom of acting so quickly, some remained attached to the Union. But the secessionist cause triumphed first in those states where slavery was strongest and most central to economic life. Mississippi's declaration could hardly have been clearer, stating openly that its position was thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Such statements strip away the fog of later myth. The new Confederate project was born above all to defend slavery. In February 1861, delegates from the seceded states met in Montgomery, Alabama, and formed the Confederate States of America. They drafted a constitution similar in many ways to that of the United States, but with stronger explicit protections for slavery. They chose Jefferson Davis of Mississippi as president and Alexander H. Stephens of Georgia as vice president. Davis was a West Point graduate, former Secretary of War, and U.S. Senator, experienced and grave, a defender of Southern rights and slavery. Stephens, in a speech delivered soon after, gave one of the bluntest explanations of the Confederacy's foundations. The new government, he said, rested upon the great truth that the black man was not equal to the white man, and that slavery, subordination to the superior race, was his natural and normal condition. However revealing and horrifying the language, it was also clarifying. The Confederacy did not come into being in spite of slavery. It came into being because of it. While the Deep South moved out, the Upper South watched and waited. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas did not secede immediately. Many there were cautious. They had ties to the Union, less dependence in some regions on plantation slavery than the Deep South, and stronger concentrations of Unionist sentiment. For a time, it remained possible to imagine that the crisis might somehow be contained. But only for a time. The months between Lincoln's election and his inauguration were among the most dangerous in American history. The sitting president, James Buchanan, believed secession was illegal, but also believed the federal government lacked authority to coerce a state back into the Union. That position satisfied no one. It signaled weakness to secessionists while alarming Unionists who believed the government must defend itself. Federal forts, arsenals, and custom houses across the South became immediate points of tension. In many places, state forces seized them, yet a few remained in federal hands, and among them, none would matter more than Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The fort stood unfinished on an artificial island, a brick symbol of federal authority in the very state that had gone first into rebellion. Major Robert Anderson, commanding US forces in Charleston, had moved his small garrison there from the more vulnerable Fort Moultrie in late December 1860. South Carolinians viewed the move as provocative. Washington saw it as prudent. The garrison was soon isolated, running short on food and supplies. As winter deepened, Fort Sumter became the visible test of whether the Union still existed as more than a phrase. Meanwhile, efforts at compromise continued, though with diminishing hope. Senator John J. Crittenden of Kentucky proposed a set of constitutional amendments that would have restored the old Missouri Compromise line and protected slavery south of it. Lincoln refused to support any settlement that allowed slavery's expansion into federal territories. That refusal was decisive. He would reassure the South where he could, promising not to interfere with slavery in existing states, but he would not surrender the central principle on which Republicans had been elected. If he abandoned that, then the election of 1860 would have meant nothing, and secession would become a successful method of extortion. The country hovered between concession and collision, while each day narrowed the room for peace. Lincoln arrived in Washington under a cloud of threat. Rumors of assassination followed his journey east. He reached the capital in February 1861, and on March 4th, he delivered his first inaugural address. It was careful, measured, and designed to calm rather than inflame. He repeated that he had no lawful right and no inclination to interfere with slavery in the states where it existed. He promised that the government would not be the aggressor, but he also insisted that the Union was perpetual, that secession was legally void, and that he would hold, occupy, and possess federal property. He appealed to shared memory and national affection, ending with one of the most famous passages in American political language, calling on the better angels of our nature. It was eloquent and sincere. It was also, by then, probably too late. In Charleston, the tension around Fort Sumter became impossible to ignore. Lincoln faced a grim choice. If he abandoned the fort, he might signal that secession could succeed without resistance. If he tried to resupply or reinforce it, he risked war. He eventually chose a middle course, notifying South Carolina authorities that he intended to send food, not arms, unless the convoy was attacked. But for Confederate leaders, even that was unacceptable. To allow federal resupply would be to admit continuing US authority inside the Confederacy's most symbolic harbor. Before dawn on April 12, 1861, Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter. Shells arced through darkness and burst above the fort, igniting the sky over Charleston Harbor. Watching crowds gathered along the shore, many with a sense of pageant and anticipation that now seems chilling. The bombardment continued for more than a day. Anderson's men, outgunned and with the fort catching fire around them, surrendered on April 13th. Remarkably, no one was killed in the bombardment itself, though deaths occurred in a later accident during evacuation honors. But the political meaning was immediate and immense. The Confederacy had fired on the United States. The long crisis of secession had turned into open war. Lincoln responded at once. On April 15th, he called for 75,000 militia volunteers to suppress the rebellion. This transformed the crisis again. For many in the Upper South, secession had remained a matter for argument, perhaps even one they still hoped to avoid. But a federal call to provide troops against fellow Southern states now made neutrality harder to sustain. Virginia seceded on April 17th, followed by Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. The Confederacy moved its capital to Richmond, Virginia, bringing the rebellion closer to Washington and giving the new nation the prestige and industrial resources of the South's largest state. Yet not every slave state joined the Confederacy. Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri remained in the Union, though with intense internal division. These border states were of enormous strategic importance. Maryland surrounded Washington on three sides. If it left, the capital might become impossible to defend. Kentucky controlled major rivers and key access to the interior. Missouri touched the west. Delaware, though smaller, carried symbolic weight. Lincoln understood with absolute clarity that keeping these states in the Union was essential. He moved firmly, at times controversially, to secure them. In Maryland, federal authorities arrested some secessionist leaders and suspended habeas corpus in certain areas. In Missouri and Kentucky, politics and military maneuvering unfolded in complex patterns. The border states would become zones of divided loyalties, guerrilla violence, and bitter neighbor-against-neighbor conflict. The human meaning of the war also began to change at once. When the guns opened on Sumter, many Northerners rallied not yet primarily for abolition, but for union. The first cry was that the nation must be preserved. Newspapers demanded action. Crowds filled public squares. Men hurried to enlist, many believing the war would be brief. They imagined one grand campaign, one decisive victory, perhaps a dramatic march, and then a restored Union by autumn. In the South, similar illusions flourished. Volunteers came forward in excitement and confidence, persuaded that martial spirit and defensive purpose would carry them to independence. Flags waved, brass bands played, uniforms were hurriedly stitched. And the language of honor and destiny echoed through both sections. But beneath those early displays of certainty lay ignorance of what modern war on such a scale would become. Neither side fully understood how long the conflict would last, how completely it would reorder politics, labor, race, and national life, or how many bodies it would consume. The old images of war still held too much sway. Valor, banners, marching columns, a test of courage. Few yet grasped that industrial capacity, railroads, entrenchments, logistics, disease, and sustained killing would define this struggle as much as courage would. For enslaved people, the outbreak of war was both terrifying and full of possibility. At first, neither side entirely understood what the war would mean for slavery in practice. The Confederacy was plainly fighting to preserve slavery and build a new slave-holding nation. The Union, in its official initial aim, fought to preserve the nation rather than immediately to abolish slavery. Yet war has a way of turning principles into pressures, and pressures into transformations. Enslaved people watched closely. They heard news in fragments, rumors carried from town to town, from plantation to plantation, by whispered conversation and careful listening. Armies were moving. Masters were leaving for military service. Authority itself was shifting. The structure of slavery, so rigid in law, would soon begin to crack under the strain of war. Still, in the spring of 1861, that future remained uncertain. What Americans knew for certain was this: 7 states had already formed a rival government before Lincoln took office. 4 more had joined after Sumter. The federal government had called up troops, and the continent now held 2 capitals, 2 presidents, 2 armies in formation, and one question that could no longer be settled by speeches alone. In city streets and country lanes, in courthouse squares and farm kitchens, the war entered ordinary life. Mothers watched sons leave. Wives folded clothing into bags. Clerks joined regiments. Farmers drilled with unfamiliar muskets. Politicians became colonels. Boys lied about their age. Sermons invoked providence. Newspapers printed maps that readers scarcely knew how to interpret. And everywhere there was talk, excited or fearful or grimly proud, of what would come next. The war had begun, but its purpose was still being contested in the minds of millions. Was it a rebellion to be crushed? A revolution to be secured? A defense of liberty? A defense of slavery? A constitutional struggle? A social reckoning? A punishment for national sin? In time, it would become all these things in different eyes. But at the beginning, what united the sections was not understanding. It was commitment. Each believed something so central was at stake that blood would now be paid for it. The Union entered the war with more people, more industry, more railroad mileage, more financial infrastructure, and a larger navy. The Confederacy entered with military traditions, interior lines in some regions, and the psychological strength of fighting defensively on home ground. Yet such balances of strength and weakness did not guarantee quick answers. War would test not only resources, but political endurance, leadership, morale, diplomacy, and the ability of each government to persuade its people to sacrifice again and again. As spring turned towards summer in 1861, thousands of volunteers gathered around Washington. Across the South, Confederate forces organized around strategic points, especially in Virginia. The land between the Potomac and Richmond would soon become one of the war's principal theaters. There was a growing sense, almost theatrical at first, that one great battle might settle everything. Civilians talked this way. Politicians hoped this way. Newspapers wrote this way. Some even packed picnic baskets when armies moved, as if war might be watched, interpreted, and concluded in an afternoon. They did not yet know that the conflict opening before them would be the deadliest war in American history. The first great illusion of the Civil War was that it would be short. That illusion had lived comfortably in both sections during the spring and early summer of 1861. Men rushed into uniform with a kind of eager gravity, as if history had chosen them for one sharp proving ground and would then release them back into ordinary life. Mothers wept, but many still believed the boys would be home by harvest. Politicians spoke in tones of determination rather than endurance. Newspapers, in both North and South, often sounded as though the coming struggle would consist of 1 or 2 hard blows, followed by a settlement imposed by whichever side had proved itself the stronger. War, in imagination, still carried too much of the old romance: drums, banners, cavalry, and the notion that courage alone could finish great questions. But war has its own way of instructing the living. In Washington, after the fall of Fort Sumter and Lincoln's call for volunteers, pressure mounted almost at once for action. The Capitol itself felt exposed. It sat near the border of slaveholding territory, and just beyond its defenses, in Virginia, Confederate forces were gathering. Citizens wanted movement. Congressmen wanted movement. Editors wanted movement. To many in the North, the rebellion looked intolerable, not only in principle, but in proximity. How could the government allow a hostile army to sit so close to the capital? How could the Union preserve its authority if it appeared passive? General Winfield Scott, the aging general-in-chief, understood something many others did not. He knew that haste in war could be fatal, and that raw volunteers needed time to train, discipline, and organize. His broader strategic thinking, later mocked by some as too slow, imagined strangling the Confederacy over time by blockade and pressure on the Mississippi River, rather than relying on one dramatic thrust. But public impatience was stronger than military caution. The people wanted an advance. They wanted proof that the rebellion could be crushed. And so, the young and largely untested Union Army under Brigadier General Irvin McDowell moved out from Washington in July 1861 toward Confederate forces near Manassas Junction in northern Virginia. Public demand had helped push the advance before the troops were fully prepared. Manassas mattered because of geography and transportation. Railroads crossed there, and the fields around Bull Run lay between Washington and the Confederate capital at Richmond. If the Union could break the Confederate line, it might open the road south and perhaps shatter the rebellion's momentum at the outset. Opposing McDowell was Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard, with General Joseph E. Johnston's troops moving to reinforce him by rail. One of the war's first dramatic uses of railroad mobility to effect a major battle. The armies that converged there were green, nervous, often poorly drilled, and filled with men whose ideas about battle had been formed more by memory of older wars than by experience. On July 21st, 1861, the armies collided in what the North called the First Battle of Bull Run, and the South called the First Battle of Manassas. The naming itself hinted at a cultural difference that would recur throughout the war, with northern usage often referring to waterways and southern usage often referring to nearby towns. The morning began with Union attempts to turn the Confederate left. Fighting opened on Matthews Hill, where Confederate defenders were driven back after sharp combat. For a time, it seemed the Union might succeed, but battles are not fixed things. They sway, break, harden, and reorganize according to terrain, leadership, timing, fear, and the strange chemistry of who yields first and who does not. By the afternoon, the struggle centered on Henry House Hill. There, Confederate resistance stiffened. Brigades arrived, lines reformed, artillery roared, and men met one another in the terrifying nearness of 19th century combat, where smoke obscured command, sound confused direction, and courage had to function in fragments rather than in clear, heroic poses. It was in this fighting that Thomas J. Jackson gained the nickname Stonewall, whether first meant as praise or frustration by those around him, a name that would become one of the most famous in the war. He stood, and his men stood, and in battle, that simple fact can alter the fate of a day. Then came the break. The Union Army, having fought hard through heat, confusion, and mountain exhaustion, began to lose cohesion. Confederate counterattacks pressed forward. Units dissolved into the larger panic of retreat. The withdrawal turned increasingly chaotic as soldiers, wagons, horses, and civilians who had come out from Washington to witness the expected triumph all crowded the roads back toward the capital. Some had treated the movement toward battle almost like an excursion, carrying picnic baskets and opera glasses, as though war might be observed from a safe distance and interpreted by polite society before supper. Instead, the retreat became a spectacle of alarm and humiliation. The first great land battle in Virginia had ended in Confederate victory after roughly 10 hours of combat, and any fantasy of a neat, bloodless theatrical war was badly wounded. The military results of First Bull Run were, in one sense, limited. The Confederates had won, but they were too disorganized to mount a major pursuit toward Washington. The Union Army had been beaten, but not destroyed. Yet the psychological effects were immense. In the South, the victory produced waves of celebration and confidence. Crowds rejoiced in Richmond. Many concluded that independence might come sooner than expected if Southern troops could continue to repel Northern invasions. The triumph seemed to confirm beliefs in Southern martial superiority, in the strength of men fighting defensively for home, and in the righteousness of the Confederate cause. In Richmond's Capitol Square, people gathered in celebration, and the city pulsed with vindication. In the North, the mood fell dark and sober. Bull Run was not merely a defeat. It was a public education in the difference between patriotic language and military reality. The rebellion would not collapse at the sight of advancing federal troops. The enemy would fight hard and fight well. Victory, if it came, would require more than enthusiasm. It would require organization, training, money, generals, supply systems, political endurance, and a willingness to continue after each burial and each setback. The war would not end in 90 days. That recognition changed the conflict almost at once. George B. McClellan, young, confident, intelligent, and already admired for earlier service in Western Virginia, was brought east to take command of the principal Union force defending Washington. He quickly became the central military figure in the North. McClellan had gifts that mattered enormously in that moment. He could inspire confidence in troops. He could organize camps, improve discipline, and turn frightened masses into something much more like an army. The force that emerged under him, later known as the Army of the Potomac, became one of the war's great instruments. Men drilled, roads were improved, fortifications rose around Washington, and the capital transformed from a nervous city at the edge of danger into one of the most heavily defended places on the continent. McClellan also had weaknesses, and these too would matter. He often overestimated enemy numbers, distrusted civilian leaders, and showed a persistent reluctance to risk the army he had so carefully built. Yet in the months after Bull Run, his caution could appear to many Northerners almost like wisdom. The country had rushed once and been embarrassed. Perhaps now method and preparation would save it. Lincoln, who had to balance military necessity against political impatience, hoped McClellan might become the general who could both build and eventually strike. But the war was larger than Virginia. To understand how the Civil War widened in 1861, it is necessary to leave the dramatic fields near Washington and look westward, southward, and into the spaces between armies. Because the conflict was not only being shaped by famous generals and set-piece battles. It was being shaped by rivers, railroads, local loyalties, enslaved people moving toward freedom, and the uncertain conduct of war in places where authority itself seemed to blur. In the border states and western regions, the war often looked less orderly than the later grand campaigns would suggest. Missouri especially became a scene of instability, divided sentiment, and violence. A slave state that remained in the Union, Missouri contained fierce secessionist and Unionist factions, and conflict there quickly mixed formal campaigning with guerrilla brutality. Men fought not only in uniformed formations, but in raids, ambushes, and retaliations that exposed how civil wars reach into neighborhoods and families. Kentucky, too, tried briefly to hold a posture of neutrality, but neutrality in civil war is rarely stable when armies want roads, rivers, and allegiance. Before long, Kentucky was drawn more fully toward the Union, though with divided loyalties that would endure. In Western Virginia, Union victories in 1861 helped preserve a region of strong pro-Union feeling inside the seceded state of Virginia. That mountainous area, less tied in many places to plantation slavery than the eastern Tidewater and Piedmont, resisted Richmond's decision to leave the Union. Over time, that division would lead to the creation of West Virginia. Even here, though, one must not simplify too much. Loyalties were mixed, and the war in the mountains was difficult and fragmented. Still, the emergence of Unionist Western Virginia revealed something important. The South was not perfectly united, just as the North was not morally or politically simple. Beneath the banners of Union and Confederacy lay many local worlds, each carrying its own calculations of survival, principle, resentment, and hope. Meanwhile, at sea and along the coast, the Union began using one of its major structural advantages: naval strength. Lincoln and Scott's broader strategic thinking included blockade, an attempt to seal off the Confederacy from international trade and weaken its economy over time. Such a policy could not work instantly. America's coastline was long, and blockading it effectively would require ships, coordination, and time. But the blockade mattered from the beginning as both a practical and diplomatic measure. It signaled that the Union intended a sustained war and claimed the Confederacy not as a legitimate independent nation, but as a rebellion under pressure. Yet perhaps the most quietly revolutionary changes of 1861 did not come first from ships or generals at all. They came from enslaved people themselves. When the war began, Union leaders were uncertain, often profoundly uncertain, about how to handle enslaved people who escaped from Confederate masters and came into Union lines. The federal government was officially fighting to restore the Union, not yet proclaiming general emancipation. In the border, slave states that had remained loyal, any aggressive anti-slavery action risked political disaster. Many commanders were cautious. Some returned fugitives. Others hesitated. The law, policy, and morality of the situation pressed against one another in tense confusion. Then, in May 1861, at Fort Monroe in Virginia, Union General Benjamin Butler faced a practical question that became a turning point. 3 enslaved men had escaped to Union lines after being used to aid Confederate military labor. Their enslaver demanded them back under the Fugitive Slave Act. Butler refused. Since Virginia claimed to have left the Union and was now at war against it, Butler argued enslaved people being used to support the Confederate war effort could be treated as contraband of war. and need not be returned. It was a legal improvisation, limited and imperfect, but historically enormous. It did not yet recognize the full humanity and rights of the escapees in the language later generations would want. Even the term itself was dehumanizing, rooted in property logic. Yet in practice, it opened a pathway to freedom for thousands. Fort Monroe became a place of refuge, and the policy spread. The war was beginning to pry slavery open from within. This development matters because it shows that emancipation was not only handed down from above at a single moment. It was pushed forward by the actions of enslaved people who seized the chaos of war as opportunity. They listened, watched, moved, and tested the lines of power as armies advanced and plantations grew less secure. Some fled by night. Some followed rumors of Union camps. Some traveled in family groups if they could. Others had to leave loved ones behind and trust that war itself might later reunite what slavery had divided. They came seeking safety, wages, food, and above all, freedom, though freedom at this stage was still uncertain, partial, and contested. Union camps were not places of easy deliverance. Conditions could be harsh. Refugees often lacked shelter, clothing, and protection from disease. Army officers differed in sympathy and policy. Northern racism didn't disappear because men wore Union blue. Still, something fundamental had changed. Slavery depended on mastery, local enforcement, and the ability to recover those who fled. War weakened all of that. The presence of Union lines created cracks in the system, and enslaved people moved toward those cracks with extraordinary courage. Congress, too, began responding to the pressures of war. In August 1861, the first Confiscation Act authorized the seizure of enslaved people used in direct support of the Confederate military effort. It was cautious, limited, and far from full emancipation. But the direction was unmistakable. A government that had entered the war declaring union as its central aim was now, under the force of events, beginning to strike at slavery, where slavery touched the rebellion. Policy was following reality, and reality was being driven not only by politicians, but by those who had the most to gain from slavery's collapse. Still, this was a war in transition, not yet the war it would become. Lincoln himself moved carefully through 1861. He hated slavery, but he also had to hold together a coalition that included conservatives, moderates, radicals, and the politically delicate border states. He knew that to move too fast might push Kentucky or Maryland towards secession, perhaps fatally wounding the Union cause. He also understood something else. Public opinion could shift, but not always by command. Leadership in democracy often means walking at the edge of what people are willing to follow, nudging, arguing, preparing, and waiting for moments when the possible becomes larger. In these early months, Lincoln was still preserving room to maneuver. He was watching generals, tracking sentiment, measuring border state loyalties, and learning, always learning, what this war required. The Confederacy, for its part, faced its own early contradictions. Its leaders had proclaimed the sovereignty of states, but war demanded centralization. Armies needed food, arms, roads, and coordination. Rail systems needed to serve national ends. Men had to be enrolled, disciplined, taxed, and supplied. A government created partly in the name of resisting federal overreach now found itself building a central wartime state. This irony would deepen as the war lengthened. The Confederate claim of liberty was always bounded and distorted by its commitment to slavery, but even on its own terms, war pushed it toward powers that some Southerners had once denounced in Washington. By the end of 1861, both sides had lost something that would never fully return: innocence about the scale of the struggle. Not innocence in the moral sense, because the nation had never been innocent where slavery was concerned, but innocence in the martial sense, the easy belief that flags and fervor could answer all hard questions. The fields of Manassas had stripped away that illusion. The camps around Washington and Richmond suggested a longer contest. The movement of enslaved refugees into Union lines hinted that the war was already becoming a war about freedom more directly than many Northern politicians had first admitted. And across the divided republic, ordinary people began adjusting their inner lives to a new reality. This was not a disturbance. It was a world. Winter approached. Camps settled into mud and disease. Letters moved back and forth between soldiers and homes, carrying a mixture of bravado, boredom, homesickness, and false reassurance. Uniforms wore thin. Officers planned. Congress argued. Newspapers speculated. Families counted days and measured silence. And in plantations and towns across the South, in contraband camps and garrison posts, in railroad depots and river landings, the forces that would define the next phase of the war were gathering. The Union had learned it could not win cheaply. The Confederacy had learned that battlefield victory did not by itself secure independence. And the enslaved had begun, in growing numbers, to make the war answer to their own longing for freedom. The conflict was deepening. If 1861 had shattered the dream of a short war, 1862 destroyed the idea that the conflict could remain limited. By the opening of that year, the struggle had begun to widen in every direction at once. Armies were larger, governments were more committed. Civilians had started to understand that sacrifice would not be measured in weeks, but in seasons, perhaps years. And most important of all, the question of slavery, which many Union leaders had at first tried to hold at the edges of the war, was moving steadily toward the center. What had begun as a war to preserve the Union was becoming, under the pressure of events, something larger and more morally dangerous and more morally clear. A war in which the fate of slavery itself would increasingly be decided. Congress moved in 1862 to end slavery in the District of Columbia, passed the Second Confiscation Act in July, and by September, Lincoln would issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, warning that enslaved people in areas still in rebellion would be declared free on January 1st, 1863. In the Western Theatre, the Union began the year with momentum. Geography made the West essential. The great river systems, especially the Tennessee, Cumberland, and Mississippi, were not simply features on a map. They were roads for armies and supply, corridors into the Confederate interior, and lines along which entire regions might be opened or broken. In February 1862, Union forces captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, and at Donelson, the Confederates lost roughly 15,000 prisoners. These victories helped break the Confederate defensive line in the West and elevated Ulysses S. Grant to national prominence. Grant was not yet the commanding figure he would later become, But he was beginning to reveal a quality that would matter more and more as the war went on. The willingness to keep moving, to absorb shock without surrendering initiative, and to understand that the Confederacy would not be beaten by caution alone. But even victory in the West came at terrible cost. In early April 1862, Confederate forces struck Grant's army near Shiloh Church on the Tennessee River. The Battle of Shiloh began with surprise and near disaster for the Union. On the first day, Confederate attacks drove Union troops back and very nearly destroyed Grant's position. Then, during the night, Union reinforcements arrived. On the second day, the Federals counterattacked and regained the field, while the Confederates retreated. What mattered in memory was not only the Union victory, but the scale of the bloodshed. The battle produced casualties on a level that stunned Americans. The Library of Congress timeline notes that around 13,000 of 63,000 Union soldiers and 11,000 of 40,000 Confederates became casualties there. Numbers like that changed how people imagined the war. Shiloh did not merely prove that the Western theatre mattered. It taught the country that entire armies could bleed in 2 days and still continue the struggle. Not long after, the Union achieved another major success when New Orleans fell in late April 1862, giving the North control of the South's largest city and one of the Confederacy's most important ports. This was strategically powerful and psychologically damaging. The Confederacy had been built partly on confidence that cotton, commerce, and international recognition might sustain it. But the tightening Union blockade, combined with the loss of major river and port positions, was already testing that confidence. The war was proving to be not merely a contest of battlefield valor, but of industry, transport, naval reach, and the ability to sustain whole populations under strain. And yet the East still possessed a magnetic force in the public imagination that the West did not. Washington and Richmond stood close together. Reporters watched every movement there. Politicians and civilians fixed their hopes on Virginia, as if the fate of the whole war might still be settled on that ground. In the spring of 1862, George B. McClellan finally launched the grand campaign on which so many Northern hopes rested. His plan was to move by water to the Virginia Peninsula, the land between the York and James rivers, and then advance toward Richmond. It was a bold design on paper, one intended to avoid a direct overland assault from Washington, and instead place the Union Army near the Confederate capital itself. The Peninsula Campaign lasted from March to July 1862 and was aimed directly at taking Richmond. McClellan was a builder of armies and a man who inspired devotion in many of his soldiers. He transformed the Army of the Potomac into a formidable instrument, but his strengths contained his weakness. He habitually believed he was outnumbered, often by wildly inflated enemy estimates, and his caution became a defining feature of his command. As the Union Army moved slowly up the peninsula, Confederate General John B. Magruder used deception and theatrics to magnify the appearance of Southern strength, helping delay McClellan's advance. Time, in war, is never neutral. Each delay gave the Confederacy a chance to reinforce Richmond. Each pause narrowed the chance of a quick Union triumph in the East. The Confederacy itself was under enormous strain by this point, and Richmond seemed threatened in a way that made the Southern government deeply anxious. Then, the leadership of the principal Confederate Army passed into the hands of Robert E. Lee. Lee had already served the Confederacy in important roles, but in the summer of 1862, he emerged as the central military figure in the East. He was not universally admired at first. Some considered him too aggressive, yet aggression, used at the right moment, can alter a war. In late June and early July, Lee launched a series of attacks known as the 7 Days Battles. These battles, fought as the climax of the Peninsula Campaign, forced McClellan away from Richmond and ended the Union drive on the Confederate capital. The campaign had opened with Northern confidence that Richmond might fall. It ended with the Union Army withdrawing to the James River, still intact, still powerful, but denied the decisive victory it had sought. This mattered far beyond the tactical level. Richmond remained in Confederate hands. Lee had seized the initiative. McClellan's reputation darkened among many in Washington, especially in Lincoln's eyes, because the president could see that opportunities were being lost to hesitation. The North had once again discovered that military strength on paper meant little if it was not translated into action at the right hour. And the Confederacy, repeatedly expected to buckle under pressure, had instead found in Lee a commander capable of striking with speed and daring. While these campaigns unfolded, the war's political meaning continued to shift. In the summer of 1862, Congress deepened federal moves against slavery. The Second Confiscation Act broadened emancipation provisions against those supporting the rebellion. These were not yet the final destruction of slavery, but they formed part of what the National Archives calls the Revolutionary Summer of 1862, when war aims and anti-slavery policy came much closer together. The longer the war continued, the harder it became to argue that the Union could crush the rebellion while leaving untouched the labor system that sustained it. Slavery fed the Confederate economy, supported military labor, and represented the very social order the Confederacy had been formed to protect. To strike slavery was increasingly to strike the rebellion itself, and enslaved people kept forcing the issue from below. They fled plantations, approached Union camps, and transformed military lines into boundaries of possibility. The legal language used by Union authorities was still often cold and incomplete, but the reality on the ground was unmistakable. The war was opening breaches in the slave system, and enslaved men, women, and children moved toward those breaches whenever they could. Washington, D.C., after compensated emancipation in April 1862, became an especially powerful symbol, a place where slavery had ended in the capital itself, and where freedom drew refugees from neighboring slaveholding regions. Yet the Confederacy was not merely surviving. In the late summer of 1862, it struck back in the East with startling force. After the Peninsula Campaign collapsed, Union leadership in Virginia was reorganized, and General John Pope took command of another federal army. Lee moved northward against him, and in late August, the armies met near the old ground of the previous year's humiliation. The Second Battle of Bull Run, or Second Manassas, ended in another significant Confederate victory. Once again, the North felt the shock of defeat in Virginia. Once again, Lee appeared the bolder, quicker commander. And once again, the road seemed open for the Confederacy to do what would once have seemed almost impossible: carry the war onto Northern soil. Lee's Maryland campaign was, in part, a gamble born of success. He hoped that moving into Maryland might influence Northern politics, gather supplies, perhaps encourage foreign recognition, and possibly strengthen pro-Confederate feeling in the border states. The campaign began in September 1862. According to the American Battlefield Trust, Lee expected operations in Maryland to move quickly, while McClellan advanced out of Washington with a much larger army, though one that included many raw recruits. Lee's invasion gave the war a new and unsettling shape. The conflict was no longer only the North marching south to suppress rebellion. It was now also the Confederacy carrying war into the Union itself. Then chance intervened in one of the war's most famous episodes. A copy of Lee's Special Orders Number 191 was lost and found by Union soldiers, giving McClellan an extraordinary glimpse into Confederate dispositions. For once, even McClellan's caution had a clear opportunity before it. He moved more rapidly than usual, and the armies converged near Sharpsburg, along Antietam Creek, on September 17, 1862. The National Park Service describes Antietam as the bloodiest single day of the Civil War. The battle surged from one sector to another, the cornfield, where lines advanced and vanished in smoke, the sunken road, later remembered as Bloody Lane, Burnside's Bridge, where Union assaults struggled to cross under fire. By day's end, the Army of the Potomac remained in possession of the field, while Lee's army withdrew back into Virginia. Tactically, Antietam was not a crushing Union victory. Strategically, it was enough. Lee's invasion had been stopped. That narrow result had consequences reaching far beyond Maryland. Lincoln had been waiting for a military success before announcing a new emancipation policy. He did not want such a proclamation to appear as the desperate gesture of a government in retreat. Antietam, imperfect as it was, gave him the opening he needed. On September 22, 1862, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that on January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in areas still in rebellion would be free. It did not immediately free every enslaved person everywhere. It did not apply to loyal border states or to certain occupied areas. Its scope reflected military and constitutional limits as Lincoln understood them. But its significance was revolutionary. The war for union had now officially become, in part and by declared policy, a war for freedom. It also linked emancipation directly to Union victory and invited black men into the armed service of the United States in the months to come. Many Northerners welcomed the shift as both moral necessity and military logic. Others recoiled, insisting this was not the war they had enlisted to fight. Democrats hostile to emancipation accused the administration of overreach. In the Confederacy, the proclamation confirmed what many white Southerners had long claimed, that the North's ultimate purpose was to destroy slavery. But for enslaved people, the meaning was electric. However incomplete and contingent, the federal government had now announced itself against slavery in the rebel states. Freedom still depended on armies, on enforcement, on survival. Yet the current of history had changed direction. Still, 1862 did not end in simple triumph for the Union. In December came Fredericksburg, another disastrous Union defeat in Virginia, where frontal assaults against entrenched Confederate positions left the attacking forces shattered, and the North once more stunned by slaughter. The pattern of hope followed by carnage, advance followed by repulse, had become familiar enough by then to feel like the war's own rhythm. Military success remained uncertain. Political unity in the North remained fragile. Confederate armies remained dangerous and resilient. But something irreversible had happened all the same. By the close of 1862, the war was no longer what it had been when the first volunteers marched out singing. It had become harder, larger, darker, and more honest. It was now a war that had begun to name slavery not merely as background, but as a central object of destruction. So the year ended with exhaustion and transformation together. The Union had made gains in the West, held the line against invasion in Maryland, and turned toward emancipation. The Confederacy had defended Richmond, won major victories in Virginia, and proved again that it could not be conquered quickly. The dead had accumulated in numbers that no early patriotism could soften. The enslaved had heard a promise, not yet complete, but no longer deniable. And across the divided nation, winter came down over camps, hospitals, refugee settlements, and homes where families waited for letters that sometimes never arrived. The war was no longer a struggle over whether the Union would survive unchanged. It was becoming the struggle that would decide what kind of Union could survive at all. On the first day of January in 1863, the war crossed a threshold from which it would not return. The Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery everywhere at once. It did not free enslaved people in the loyal border states, and it did not immediately liberate those living in places already under Union occupation, where Lincoln had exempted certain areas for political and constitutional reasons. Yet what it did was immense. It declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are, and henceforward, shall be free, making emancipation an official war aim of the United States and transforming the struggle in the eyes of the world. It made clear that the Union would no longer seek simply to restore the old nation as it had been, with slavery intact, where military necessity found it inconvenient to challenge. Now the war for union and the war against slavery were joined. For enslaved people, the proclamation was not magic, but it was a signal of enormous power. Freedom still depended on armies, distance, chance, and survival. An enslaved family deep within Confederate territory was not suddenly surrounded by Union protection because Lincoln had signed a document in Washington. But words issued by the federal government mattered when those words were tied to advancing armies, to camps of refuge, to military recruitment, and to the slow collapsing authority of slaveholders in a country at war. News of emancipation traveled in fragments, in whispers, in newspapers read aloud, in rumors carried by soldiers and laborers and ministers and boatmen. And everywhere that enslaved people heard it, the meaning was plain enough. The government that had once tolerated slavery was now publicly aligned against it in the rebel states. The proclamation also altered diplomacy. European governments, especially Britain and France, had watched the American conflict with a mix of calculation and caution. There had always been a possibility, at least in Southern hopes, that Confederate battlefield success and the economic lure of cotton might draw recognition or mediation from abroad. But once the Union openly tied its cause to emancipation, support for the Confederacy became far more difficult for governments ruling societies where anti-slavery sentiment carried political force. The war was no longer as easily framed overseas as a contest between two rival nations of equal moral standing. One side was now officially fighting, however imperfectly and strategically, in the name of freedom. The proclamation also opened the Union Army more fully to black soldiers, and this was one of its most consequential effects. African American men had long pressed for the right to fight, understanding that military service could become both a path to liberation and a claim to citizenship. In 1863, that possibility became real on a large scale. Black men enlisted in growing numbers in the United States colored troops and in state-raised regiments like the 54th Massachusetts. Their service would reshape the war and the nation, though it would also expose them to brutal inequality. Many white officers doubted them. The federal government initially paid black soldiers less than white soldiers, and if captured by Confederates, black troops faced especially grave danger, since the Confederate government often refused to treat them as legitimate soldiers. Even so, they came forward in large numbers, staking their bodies on the proposition that freedom must be defended by those who had been denied it. As the political meaning of the war deepened, the military struggle in 1863 moved toward two great turning points, one in the East and one in the West. In the East, Robert E. Lee remained the Confederacy's central hope. His victories in Virginia had lifted Southern morale and shaken Northern confidence. Though Fredericksburg in December 1862 had been a terrible Union defeat, the Army of the Potomac remained in being, and the war resumed in the spring. In May 1863, at Chancellorsville, Lee won one of his most celebrated victories, outmaneuvering a larger Union force under Joseph Hooker. Yet even triumph came mixed with loss. During the campaign, Stonewall Jackson, perhaps Lee's boldest subordinate, was accidentally shot by his own men and later died. The Confederacy had won on the field, but it had lost one of its most gifted commanders. Lee's decision after Chancellorsville was characteristic of him. Rather than remain on the defensive, he would take the war north again. The Gettysburg campaign that followed was his second invasion of the North. Its objectives were multiple and ambitious. An advance into Pennsylvania might relieve war-ravaged Virginia during the growing season, gather supplies, influence Northern politics, damage Union morale, and perhaps achieve a battlefield victory on Northern soil, powerful enough to alter the larger course of the conflict. This was not madness. By the summer of 1863, the Confederacy still believed that one great success might shift the war's political balance, especially if the North's will faltered before its material power could fully assert itself. The Union Army, meanwhile, underwent another change in leadership. Just days before the coming battle, George G. Meade took command of the Army of the Potomac. He inherited not a polished opportunity, but a dangerous one. Lee was already moving through Pennsylvania. The Northern public was alarmed, and the Union Army had to find, fix, and stop the Confederate advance. The armies met not because one side had chosen some grand ceremonial battleground in advance, but through the confusion and momentum of campaign movement. On July 1st, 1863, Confederate forces encountered Union troops west of the town of Gettysburg, and the battle grew from there into one of the most famous engagements in American history. The first day ended badly for the Union in tactical terms. Federal troops were driven back through the town, suffering heavily, but they managed to regroup on high ground south of Gettysburg, Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, Culp's Hill, and eventually Little Round Top, forming a strong defensive line. That position mattered enormously. Armies do not only fight with courage, they fight with ground. By holding the heights, the Union Army turned what might have been a rout into a defensible stance. The second day brought savage attacks across a broad arc of the field, including fierce fighting at Little Round Top, the wheat field, the peach orchard, and Culp's Hill. Again and again, Confederate assaults crashed against Union positions, sometimes gaining ground, sometimes being thrown back, often leaving fields thick with dead and wounded. Then came July 3rd, and the assault forever remembered as Pickett's Charge, though men from several Confederate divisions took part. Lee, convinced that the Union center on Cemetery Ridge could be broken, ordered a massive attack after artillery preparation. Across open ground, under devastating fire, Confederate soldiers advanced in long lines toward the Union position. Some reached the stone wall, some briefly penetrated the line, but they could not hold. The attack failed at terrible cost. Gettysburg ended as a decisive Union victory, and Lee's army withdrew back to Virginia. The National Park Service identifies roughly 51,000 total casualties at Gettysburg, making it one of the bloodiest battles of the war and the battle with the most casualties ever fought in North America. Just as important, it thwarted Lee's second invasion of the North and blunted Confederate hopes for a war-altering triumph on Union soil. Gettysburg has become so monumental in memory that it can seem inevitable, but it was not. It was contingent, exhausting, confused, and human. Men fought in orchards, on rocky slopes, in town streets, behind fences, along ridge lines, through smoke so thick that command dissolved into noise and instinct. Surgeons worked without rest. Civilians in Gettysburg saw homes, barns, churches, and fields become hospitals, prison grounds, and burial landscapes. And after the armies moved on, the town remained surrounded by the evidence of what battle meant when tens of thousands of armed men collided in one place over 3 days. While the East watched Gettysburg, the West was delivering a blow no less decisive. Ulysses S. Grant had spent months driving toward Vicksburg, the Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. The city's location made it indispensable, as long as Vicksburg and nearby positions remained in Confederate hands. The South could contest control of the river and maintain some connection between the eastern and western parts of the Confederacy. Grant's campaign was one of the war's most skillful. Through maneuver, river crossings, inland fighting, and persistent pressure, he forced Confederate Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton back into Vicksburg and laid siege to the city. In May and June of 1863, Union forces invested the place, trapping the Confederate army inside. On July 4th, after 47 days of siege, Vicksburg surrendered. With it, the Union secured control of the Mississippi River and effectively split the Confederacy in two. The fall of Vicksburg and the victory at Gettysburg came almost simultaneously, and together they changed the shape of the war. The Confederacy still possessed armies, resolve, and dangerous capacity. It would fight on for nearly 2 more years, and with dreadful effect. But after July 1863, its strategic horizon narrowed. In the east, Lee had failed to secure decision in the north. In the west, the Mississippi was lost. The Union now held the great river from source to gulf, severing Texas, Arkansas, and much of Louisiana from the rest of the Confederacy in practical military terms. Grant's reputation soared. Increasingly, he appeared to be the Union general who understood what a war required: continuous pressure, coordinated movement, and a refusal to be paralyzed by casualties or setbacks. Yet 1863 was not only the year of white generals and famous battle maps, it was also the year that black military service forced the nation to look more directly at the relationship between freedom and citizenship. The 54th Massachusetts became the most famous black regiment of the war, though far from the only one. Its assault on Fort Wagner near Charleston in July 1863 ended in military failure. But in symbolic and political terms, it was transformative. The regiment suffered terrible losses, and its courage under fire helped convince many skeptics in the North that black soldiers would fight with discipline and determination. The attack did not capture the fort that night, but it entered public memory as a turning point in perception. Black military service could no longer be dismissed as theory. It had been proven in blood. That proof mattered because the war was becoming a contest not only over territory, but over the future meaning of the Republic. If black men could fight and die for the United States, what argument remained for denying them any claim to the nation they defended? The answer, in practice, was that racism remained powerful in North as well as South, and the path from service to equal citizenship would be long, violent, and incomplete. But the logic of events was mounting. Emancipation, black enlistment, and Union victory were becoming inseparable threads. Each strengthened the others. Every mile the Union advanced into slave country, every black recruit in blue uniform, every plantation emptied by flight, every Confederate complaint about servile insurrection or labor loss pointed toward the same truth. Slavery was not merely one issue within the war. It was the central structure being broken by it. Lincoln himself understood the year's transformation with growing depth. In November 1863, when he spoke at Gettysburg to dedicate a national cemetery, his remarks were famously brief. But in those few words, he recast the war's meaning. The struggle was not only about restoring an old constitutional arrangement. It was about whether a nation conceived in liberty could endure. It was about a new birth of freedom. He connected the sacrifice of the dead to a future in which democratic self-government might survive only by becoming more faithful to its own founding claim. Though those words came after the battles, they belong to the same turning of the war. 1863 had made them possible. And still, the suffering widened. Victory in battle did not prevent hunger in besieged towns, disease in camps, amputations in hospitals, or grief in houses where no triumph could return the missing. Confederate families faced tightening shortages and growing strain. Union families endured draft controversies, casualty lists, and political argument over the war's purpose. The war was becoming harder even as its direction became clearer. A cause can grow more just and more painful at the same time. In 1863, that was exactly what happened. By year's end, the Confederacy had not collapsed, but it had been pushed onto a more defensive and desperate path. The Union had not finished the war, but it had gained the initiative in ways that would endure. Emancipation was no longer merely hinted at or partially improvised. It was embedded in federal policy and in the movement of armies. Black soldiers were no longer imagined participants in the struggle. They were present, armed, and indispensable, and the twin shadows of Gettysburg and Vicksburg stretched across the continent, marking the year when the balance of the war began to tilt. By 1864, the Civil War had become something harder than a contest of armies, and larger than a dispute over states. It had become a test of endurance so severe that whole societies were now being measured by what they could bear, what they could still believe, and what they were willing to destroy in order to win. The easy language of the early war had mostly burned away. There was less talk now of one splendid victory ending everything. Too many suns had gone out and not returned. Too many regiments had been cut down and rebuilt and cut down again. Too many towns had turned churches into hospitals and courthouses into storehouses for grief. In the North, hope still existed, but it had grown stern. In the South, defiance still existed, but it had become thinner, more strained, more dependent on faith. That one more campaign, one more great stroke, one more northern failure of will might still secure independence. The war had entered its age of attrition. No figure represented that shift more clearly than Ulysses S. Grant. In March 1864, Lincoln promoted Grant to lieutenant general and placed him in command of all Union armies, the first officer to hold that rank since George Washington. This was more than a military appointment. It was a political decision, a moral decision, and a strategic decision all at once. Lincoln had spent years searching for a commander who would not simply hold territory or build armies, but use them with relentless purpose. Grant had proven in the West that he understood something central about the war. The Confederacy could not be defeated by occasional bravery or isolated success. It had to be pressed everywhere, repeatedly, without giving its armies room to recover their balance. He now brought that philosophy east. Grant's grand strategy for 1864 was coordinated pressure. He would travel with the Army of the Potomac in Virginia, where George G. Meade technically remained its commander, and there he would confront Robert E. Lee directly. At the same time, other Union armies would move in different theaters so that the Confederacy could not shift troops from one crisis to another with ease. William Tecumseh Sherman would advance toward Atlanta in Georgia. Union forces would also continue pressing in the Shenandoah Valley and elsewhere. Grant's object was not simply to defeat one Confederate army in one great battle. It was to deny the Confederacy rest. When the Overland Campaign opened in May 1864, it began with a kind of grim clarity. Grant crossed the Rapidan River and moved into Virginia's wilderness, the same tangled region where hard fighting had occurred before. Lee responded quickly. The dense thickets and scrub forest of the wilderness neutralized much of the Union advantage in artillery and made battle there chaotic, close, and terrifying. Men fired into smoke and brush without always seeing whom they hit. Units lost direction. Flames spread through dry undergrowth, and some wounded men, unable to crawl away, were burned where they lay. The wilderness was a place that distorted order itself, where command became uncertain, and the environment joined the killing. The Battle of the Wilderness, fought on May 5th and 6th, 1864, did not produce a clean decision. It produced carnage and confusion, as so many battles had before. But what followed made it different. Previous Union commanders in Virginia, after taking such losses, had often fallen back toward Washington. Grant did not. Instead, when the fighting ended, he turned his army southward, continuing the movement toward Richmond rather than retreating. Soldiers of the Army of the Potomac understood the significance almost at once. The road they marched on mattered morally as much as physically. This commander, whatever else might be said of him, was not going back. That choice set the tone for the entire campaign. At Spotsylvania Courthouse, the armies collided again. Trenches deepened. Attacks struck fortified lines with horrifying cost. The fighting at the Bloody Angle became one of the war's most savage scenes, with prolonged hand-to-hand combat, artillery at close range, and rain-soaked earth churned with bodies. Men fought across earthworks so fiercely that trees were cut down by musket fire. Again, the Union suffered terribly. Again, Lee's army held. Again, Grant moved on, south to the North Anna, then to Cold Harbor. He did not stop simply because the price was high, though the price was in truth immense. The Overland Campaign, in a matter of weeks, became a grinding contest of endurance between the two most important armies in the East. Cold Harbor became one of the names that would haunt the Union memory of the war. On June 3rd, 1864, Federal troops attacked entrenched Confederate lines and were repulsed with terrible losses in a short span of time. The battle reinforced the image of Grant among some critics as a general willing to trade lives for movement. That judgment was sharpened by the scale of the bloodshed throughout the campaign. Yet the larger reality was more complex. Grant understood that Lee's army, unlike earlier in the war, could no longer replace its losses as readily as the Union could. Every engagement hurt both sides, but not equally in strategic consequence. Grant was turning the war in Virginia into a struggle the Confederacy could not indefinitely afford. It was brutal arithmetic, and it was paid for in flesh. Still, even Cold Harbor was not the end of movement. In one of the campaign's most important maneuvers, Grant crossed the James River and aimed at Petersburg, the rail center south of Richmond. Petersburg mattered because railroads feeding Richmond and Lee's army converged there. If the Union could seize Petersburg, Richmond itself might become untenable. Initial Union opportunities in June 1864 were missed, and the city did not fall quickly. Instead, the war in Virginia settled into a long siege around Petersburg and Richmond, a siege that would last for months and foreshadow the trench warfare of a later age. The Overland Campaign thus evolved into the Siege of Petersburg, where earthworks, artillery, raids, exhaustion, and attrition became the daily grammar of war. If Virginia had become a furnace of persistence, Georgia became a theater of movement, pressure, and destruction under Sherman. Sherman's Atlanta campaign in 1864 was one of the Union's most significant operations. Starting from Chattanooga, he moved against Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston and, later, John Bell Hood. Driving steadily toward Atlanta, one of the South's most important railroad and manufacturing centers. Sherman was not always dramatic in the style of Lee, but he was exceptionally capable in using maneuver to force opponents out of position. Again and again, he threatened Confederate lines of communication, compelling retreats even when direct assaults might have been more costly. The campaign unfolded through a series of battles and flanking movements across North Georgia, wearing down Confederate resistance and closing on the city. Atlanta mattered militarily, but it also mattered politically in a year when Northern political patience was under strain. Throughout the summer of 1864, casualties mounted in Virginia, while the war seemed still unfinished. Peace sentiment in parts of the North grew louder. Democrats prepared to campaign against Lincoln, and many Americans feared that the Union might fail, not only on the battlefield, but at the ballot box. Then came Sherman's success. Atlanta fell to Union forces in early September 1864, and the impact in the North was electric. The capture of the city provided proof that the long pressure was working, proof that sacrifice had not been for nothing, and proof that the Confederacy could be broken further. It transformed the political atmosphere of the autumn. But Sherman was not finished. After taking Atlanta, he proposed something still more radical. Rather than remain tied to conventional supply lines in Georgia, he would march to the sea, living off the land where possible, and destroying infrastructure useful to the Confederate war effort. Grant approved. Sherman left Atlanta in mid-November with roughly 60,000 men and began the march to the sea, cutting a broad swath through Georgia towards Savannah. His forces tore up railroads, destroyed military resources and industrial capacity, seized food and livestock, and left behind the twisted rails later remembered as Sherman's neckties. The campaign aimed not merely to defeat Confederate armies in battle, but to break the logistical and psychological foundations of Confederate resistance. It is important, though, to describe this carefully. Sherman's march has often been remembered in either romantic or monstrous simplification, as if it were either the clean brilliance of modern war or nothing but indiscriminate cruelty. In truth, it was a campaign of strategic destruction carried out across a civilian landscape. Homes were entered, goods seized, property ruined, railroads torn up, barns burned, and the war was brought directly into the daily life of Georgia. There were limits and rules, but they did not prevent suffering. Sherman believed that the Confederacy's people must be made to feel the hard hand of war, so that their government's ability and will to continue might finally collapse. This was not annihilation, but it was a deliberate widening of war's pressure beyond battlefields alone. Georgia was to howl, and in many places it did. Along Sherman's route, enslaved people came into Union lines in large numbers. The march, therefore, destroyed Confederate material, while also accelerating slavery's breakdown. Families followed the columns where they could, trusting that Union movement offered at least the possibility of safety and freedom. Yet this too was harsh and uncertain. Army movement was not designed primarily as humanitarian rescue. Refugees often faced hunger, exposure, and danger. Still, the larger historical truth remained. Wherever Union armies advanced deep into the Confederate interior, slavery weakened, and enslaved people themselves acted on that weakening with courage and urgency. Black soldiers were also becoming more deeply embedded in Union victory. By the war's later years, nearly 180,000 black men served in the Union Army, and their contribution was indispensable. Tens of thousands gave their lives. Their service had military value in manpower, labor, garrison duty, and combat, but it also had immense political and moral significance. Black enlistment made emancipation harder to reverse and gave freedom a sword arm of its own. Men who had been denied citizenship were now helping save the nation and destroy slavery. The Confederacy, in 1864, faced pressure on every side, but it did not simply collapse. Lee remained dangerous at Petersburg. Southern armies still fought hard. Confederate civilians, especially women managing households under extreme deprivation, bore growing burdens of shortage, inflation, and uncertainty. Bread riots and signs of home front strain had already appeared, and by 1864, many Southerners were living under a daily weight of scarcity. Rail systems deteriorated. Food distribution faltered. Enslaved labor became less reliable as more people fled or resisted under the shadow of Union advance. Yet even under these conditions, Confederate nationalism did not vanish. Many white Southerners still believed surrender would bring humiliation, racial upheaval, and the destruction of the world they understood. That belief kept armies in the field long after material logic alone might have dictated surrender. In the North, meanwhile, the war's political crisis peaked in the presidential election of 1864. Lincoln faced re-election under conditions that would have broken many governments. The war was unfinished. Casualty lists were endless. Opposition Democrats nominated George B. McClellan, once Lincoln's own general, on a platform shadowed by demands for peace, though McClellan himself took a more warlike line than some in his party. For a time in the summer, Lincoln himself believed he might lose. If he did, and if a peace candidate took office before Union victory was secured, the whole course of the war might change. The Union could fracture politically at the very moment it seemed strongest materially. The fall of Atlanta transformed that danger. Military success revived Northern confidence, and Lincoln won re-election in November 1864 against McClellan. The result carried deep meaning. It showed that even after years of suffering, Northern voters were prepared to continue the war rather than accept a compromise peace that might leave slavery partly intact or Confederate independence possible. Lincoln's victory also signaled that emancipation and union had become politically intertwined strongly enough to endure a national election. The Republic had submitted the war's direction to voters in the middle of war and chosen perseverance. There was something almost astonishing about that. In many countries, such a war might have ended democracy rather than tested it. Yet the United States held an election amid sieges, campaigns, blockades, hospital wards, and battle reports. And the government accepted the result as the legitimate expression of public will. That did not erase coercion, exclusion, or racial injustice. Women still could not vote. Most African Americans in the South had no secure political standing. But even so, the election of 1864 became one of the strongest answers to those who claimed democratic government could not survive a great civil conflict. The people of the Union, battered and grieving, had chosen to go on. And so, the year moved toward its close. In December, Sherman reached Savannah, offering the captured city to Lincoln as a kind of Christmas gift. The gesture was theatrical, but the achievement behind it was real. Grant held Lee at Petersburg. Sherman had cut through Georgia. Lincoln had been re-elected. The Confederacy still resisted, still killed, still hoped in places. But the circle around it was tightening. The war was no longer turning on whether the Union could be shocked into abandoning the struggle. That chance had been the South's great hope in earlier years. By the end of 1864, it was fading. Yet one must not tell the story too neatly. For the men in the trenches around Petersburg, for the civilians watching armies pass through their counties, for the refugees walking behind columns, for the enslaved trying to convert military disruption into lasting freedom, the future was still uncertain. Nothing felt guaranteed when winter came on. Death remained intimate. Hunger remained real. Letters still failed to arrive. Freedom, though nearer, was not yet secured in law everywhere or in life for everyone. The Confederacy, though weakening, still had armies in the field and a capacity for desperate resistance. But the shape of the end was beginning to show. Grant had made the Eastern War a hammer blow repeated without pause. Sherman had made the Confederate interior vulnerable and exposed. Lincoln had survived the ballot box and emerged with renewed authority. And slavery, the great wound from which the war had come, was now being crushed not only by proclamation and principle, but by marching columns, military recruitment, political choice, and the breaking of the Confederacy's physical power. The war that had once seemed a contest over Union alone had become a vast reckoning over what the nation would be after slavery. By the opening months of 1865, the Confederacy was still alive, but it was no longer living with the same pulse. It still had armies in the field. It still had a government in Richmond. It still had men who believed or tried to believe that endurance itself might somehow produce a miracle. But the shape of the war had changed too much, and too many doors had already closed. The Union had pressed inward from multiple directions. The Mississippi was gone. Atlanta was gone. Savannah was gone. Sherman had cut through Georgia and was now turning north through the Carolinas. Grant remained locked against Lee around Petersburg and Richmond, grinding down the Confederacy's greatest army. Lincoln had been re-elected, which meant the North had chosen continuation, not compromise. And slavery, the institution for which the Confederacy had been formed and defended, was collapsing under the weight of war. The final year of the Civil War did not begin with one neat event that announced the end. It began with pressure, with hunger, with exhaustion, with fraying supply lines and narrowing possibilities. In many parts of the South, ordinary people felt the war now less as patriotic pageantry than as a constant and intimate depletion. Food was scarcer. Prices were higher. Transportation faltered. Clothing wore out and was not easily replaced. Horses and mules were harder to keep. Railroads, overused and under-maintained, became less reliable. The Confederate government had never possessed the industrial depth of the North, and now that weakness pressed into everyday life. There is a point in every long war when belief can no longer stand on rhetoric alone. It must survive on less food, less hope, fewer letters, more graves. By 1865, much of the Confederacy had reached that point. Yet armies still stood between collapse and surrender. Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia remained the Confederacy's central military symbol and, in practical terms, its greatest shield. For months, it had held the lines around Petersburg and Richmond against Grant's immense pressure. Those lines were not simply trenches. They were the thin edges of a world still trying to continue. Behind them sat Richmond, the Confederate capital, a city that had become both administrative center and emotional emblem. To lose Richmond would be to lose more than government offices and warehouses. It would be to lose the image of Confederacy itself. The men in the trenches around Petersburg had endured a kind of warfare very different from the sweeping campaigns with which the war had begun. They lived in earthworks, among mud, rats, lice, artillery fire, and the endless strain of waiting under threat. Winter made everything harder. Clothing wore thin. Smoke hung low. Wet ground chilled the bones. There were raids, bombardments, sharpshooting, and constant fear of sudden death. But perhaps the hardest burden was monotony joined to dread. It is one thing to charge into battle with adrenaline still lifting the body. It is another to wake every day knowing that danger is ordinary, that hunger is ordinary, that fatigue is ordinary, and that even survival has become repetitive labor. Grant understood that he did not need one theatrical victory if he could continue tightening pressure until Lee's army could neither feed itself nor maneuver effectively. This was the logic he had carried through 1864, and now into 1865. The Confederacy was not a fortress to be shattered at one gate. It was an organism to be deprived of blood, movement, and breath. Every railroad line cut, every supply point taken, every failed Confederate attempt to break out shortened the life of the rebellion. Critics sometimes saw only the grim casualty totals of Grant's campaigns, but what made him historically decisive was not indifference to cost for its own sake. It was his unwillingness to let battlefield shock interrupt strategic intention. He kept the war moving toward conclusion. Far to the south, Sherman's advance through the Carolinas deepened Confederate despair. His march to the sea had already shown that large Union armies could move through the Confederate interior, tear up railroads, seize provisions, and destroy military infrastructure while opening further cracks in slavery. Now his forces pushed north from Savannah into South Carolina, the first state to secede, and, in the eyes of many Northerners, the symbolic cradle of disunion. South Carolina experienced war with a severity that carried moral and emotional weight beyond strategy alone. Towns burned, railroads were wrecked, storehouses were emptied, civilians fled or watched what they could not save. In Columbia, fire consumed much of the city after Union occupation, and debate would endure over the exact causes and responsibilities. But whatever mixture of accident, confusion, military action, and uncontrollable flame produced it, the result was devastation. To many white Southerners, Sherman became the face of modern hardness in war. The man who seemed determined not merely to defeat armies, but to punish a society. To many in the North, he represented an overdue realism. The Confederacy had sustained itself on the labor of the enslaved, on railroads, granaries, depots, livestock, mills, and civilian commitment. War could not remain politely confined to open fields, while one side continued to draw strength from the untouched life around those fields. Sherman meant to make the Confederate home front feel directly what the war had become. In doing so, he intensified a question that shadows all modern conflict. When does pressure on a hostile society become military necessity? And when does necessity become cruelty? The Civil War did not settle that question. It lived inside it. As Sherman's columns moved, enslaved people continued to seize freedom in the war's wake. This point is worth dwelling on, because the closing phase of the war can sometimes be told only through generals and capitals, as if freedom were handed down by documents and secured by famous men alone. But slavery died not only in Washington and Appomattox. It died in thousands of acts of movement, refusal, escape, enlistment, labor disruption, and witness. It died when enslaved families left plantations because armies had come too near for masters to control them. It died when black men entered Union service and returned in uniform to regions where they had once been hunted or sold. It died when slaveholders, pressed by invasion and collapse, could no longer enforce obedience with confidence. The Emancipation Proclamation had changed federal policy. The 13th Amendment was moving toward law, but on the ground, freedom was being made real in fragments by those who had waited generations to touch it. And in January 1865, one of the most important political acts in American history took place in Washington. The 13th Amendment passed the House of Representatives after having previously cleared the Senate. Its language was simple and monumental. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, would exist within the United States or any place subject to its jurisdiction. With that, the destruction of slavery moved from wartime military policy toward permanent constitutional transformation. Lincoln had long understood that the Emancipation Proclamation, though revolutionary, rested on war powers and might later face challenge. The amendment would do what military necessity alone could not fully secure. It would make abolition part of the nation's fundamental law. This moment deserves to be seen for what it was. The Civil War had begun in a republic still chained to its original compromise with slavery, even as late as 1861. The Union had entered war officially to preserve itself, not yet to abolish slavery everywhere. 4 years later, after unimaginable bloodshed, the United States government was moving to erase slavery from the Constitution's reach altogether. That change was not inevitable. It came through pressure from abolitionists, the action of enslaved people, the service of black soldiers, the calculations of politicians, the growth of Union anti-slavery policy, and the grinding reality that the Confederacy itself had made slavery impossible to separate from the war. History sometimes moves by argument, sometimes by force, and sometimes by the terrible convergence of both. The 13th Amendment was born of that convergence. Lincoln entered the last phase of the war not as the cautious new president of 1861, but as a leader who'd been altered by responsibility, grief, and time. He had lost some of the earlier elasticity of hope, but none of his moral seriousness. He had become more certain on slavery, more seasoned in command, and more aware of how easily victory could be spoiled by revenge or by political foolishness. His second inaugural address, delivered in March 1865, remains one of the most remarkable speeches ever given by an American president, because it did not celebrate triumph in the ordinary sense. Lincoln did not use the moment simply to boast of nearing victory. Instead, he looked backward across the war as a national judgment for the offense of slavery. He spoke with a kind of mournful grandeur, refusing to flatter either side with innocence. Both read the same Bible, he said. Both prayed to the same God. Yet the war had come, and if it continued until every drop of blood drawn with the lash was paid by another drawn with the sword, still the judgments of the Lord would be true and righteous altogether. It was not the language of vengeance, it was the language of reckoning. And yet, even in that reckoning, Lincoln reached toward mercy, with malice toward none, with charity for all, he said. Words that have been remembered so often, they risk becoming polished and distant. But in that hour, they were astonishingly alive. He was speaking at the edge of victory, and he was already warning the country that how it ended the war would matter nearly as much as winning it. The Union must survive. Slavery must end. But the peace to come would require more than punishment. It would require rebuilding a political world from ruins. The Confederacy, however, was not yet ready to yield. In March 1865, Lee's army still held a long, overextended line around Petersburg, but the cracks were widening. Desertion increased. Rations dwindled. Horses weakened. The Union continued extending its left flank, threatening rail connections that kept Confederate forces alive. Lee could read a map and a ration report as well as any man. He knew the situation was perilous. Still, he remained bound by duty to continue while some chance of escape or junction with other forces remained. That chance began vanishing in early April. Union offensives finally broke critical Confederate positions near Petersburg. On April 2nd, Lee informed Jefferson Davis that Richmond and Petersburg had to be evacuated. The message reached Davis while he was in church, a moment so dramatic that it seems almost invented by a novelist. But history often arranges its own theatre. The Confederate government fled Richmond. Officials packed what they could and left by rail. Fires broke out in the city during the evacuation, whether from orders to destroy supplies, spreading accident, or the confusion of collapse. Flames consumed warehouses and then leapt outward, and Richmond, the city that had stood so long as the Confederacy's center, entered the Union not in proud defiance but in smoke. When Union troops entered Richmond, they entered a city transformed by both defeat and liberation. For many white Confederates, the moment was humiliation, grief, disbelief. For African Americans, especially those who had lived under bondage or in its shadow, the fall of Richmond meant something very different. It was a day of jubilation, of tears, of prayers answered in forms once scarcely imaginable. Crowds of black Richmonders greeted Union soldiers with a reverence that some Northern observers scarcely knew how to process. Freedom was not an abstraction here. It was the sudden collapse of mastery in one of the rebellion's most symbolic capitals. Lee retreated westward, hoping to join forces with Joseph E. Johnston in North Carolina, or at least to reach supplies that might keep his army moving. But the Army of Northern Virginia was now less an instrument of strategic possibility than a body in accelerated dissolution. Men marched hungry, many fell out, wagons clogged the roads, Union cavalry and infantry pressed from different directions. At Sailor's Creek on April 6th, large portions of Lee's retreating army were cut off and badly damaged. Lee is said to have exclaimed, "My God, has the army dissolved?" Whether remembered precisely or not, the sentiment captured the truth. The army was not gone, but it was coming apart under pressure faster than command could repair it. The final movement ended near the village of Appomattox Courthouse. Lee hoped to reach supplies there, then continue west. Instead, he found Union forces blocking the road. On April 9th, 1865, seeing no reasonable escape and unwilling to destroy what remained of his army in useless sacrifice, he agreed to meet Grant. Their meeting at the McLean House has become one of the most iconic scenes in American memory. Grant arrived mud-spattered, in a private's blouse with Lieutenant General shoulder straps. Lee came in full dress uniform, dignified and composed. The contrast was striking, but what mattered more was the tone. Grant offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers would be paroled and allowed to return home. Officers could keep sidearms. Men who owned horses could take them for spring planting. The aim was surrender, not humiliation. The Army of Northern Virginia laid down its arms. Appomattox was not the instant end of all fighting everywhere, but it was the decisive collapse of the Confederacy's greatest army. Other Confederate forces would surrender in the weeks that followed. Johnston surrendered to Sherman later in April. Confederate resistance west of the Mississippi lingered briefly longer. Yet after Appomattox, the essential military outcome was no longer in doubt. The Confederacy was finished as a viable war-making nation. And with that collapse came scenes of feeling almost too large for ordinary language. In the North, church bells rang, crowds gathered, newspapers rushed out extra editions, bands played, and people wept in relief. 4 years of strain had at last produced the answer for which so many had buried their dead. The Union had survived. In the South, the mood was very different. Exhaustion, bitterness, disbelief, numbness, and, among some, the beginning of a myth that would later try to ennoble defeat while hiding or softening slavery's central place in the conflict. But beneath all later memory lay the plain fact. The Confederacy had been beaten in war, and slavery had been destroyed with it. For the newly freed, however, the ending of the war was both triumph and uncertainty. Freedom had arrived, but freedom is not the same as safety, land, rights, wages, schooling, or protection. From those who had once claimed ownership over your body and still possessed local power, weapons, and rage. Across the South, the first days of peace were not simple. Families searched for loved ones sold away years earlier. Men and women tested whether labor could now be negotiated rather than commanded. Churches and schools became urgent centers of community life. Black soldiers stood as visible proof that the old order had cracked. Yet danger was everywhere. White resistance to freedom did not vanish because Lee surrendered. In some places, it sharpened. And then, just days after Appomattox, came another national wound. On the evening of April 14th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth while attending a play at Ford's Theatre in Washington. He died the next morning. The timing seemed almost unbearable. The president who had carried the nation through its bloodiest trial, who had lived long enough to see Union victory and slavery's constitutional destruction nearing completion, was gone before he could guide the peace. The rejoicing that had followed military triumph gave way to shock and mourning. Bells that had rung in celebration now tolled in grief. The country that had been lifted by the sense of ending found itself plunged into sorrow again. Lincoln's death altered the future immediately. He had been preparing to oversee Reconstruction. The vast and unfinished question, of how the defeated South would be restored, how freedom would be protected, and what political place formerly enslaved people would hold in the Republic. No one can say with certainty what Lincoln would have done in every particular, but it is impossible not to feel, at this moment in the story, the weight of what the nation lost. Victory had come, but its most careful steward was dead. So, the war ended, not in pure triumph, but in a mixture that would define American memory ever after. Relief and grief, freedom and uncertainty, reunion and resentment, greatness and incompletion. The Confederacy had fallen. Slavery had been mortally struck. The Union had survived. But peace had arrived carrying unresolved questions large enough to shape the next century. When the guns fell silent, the hardest questions did not disappear. They changed shape. War has a way of making endings look cleaner than they are. Armies surrender, capitals fall, flags are lowered. Men stack rifles in formal rows and walk away under terms agreed upon by generals. Historians can point to dates and documents, to Appomattox and the surrender of other Confederate forces, to the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December 1865, and say with precision when the rebellion ended and when slavery was abolished in law throughout the United States. All of that is necessary. But for the people who lived through it, especially in the South, the end of the Civil War did not arrive as one clean sunrise after a long night. It arrived in fragments, in rumors, in empty roads where armies had passed, in burned courthouses, in ruined fields, in churches filled with prayer, in households missing sons, in black families searching for names and faces long taken from them, in white families trying to imagine a world without slavery and often refusing to imagine it honestly at all. The Confederacy had collapsed, but the society that had made the Confederacy did not vanish with it. That is one of the most important truths to understand about the aftermath of the Civil War. The war had destroyed slavery as a legal institution and crushed the attempt to found an independent slaveholding nation. But it had not erased the beliefs, habits, fears, ambitions, and racial hierarchy that slavery had cultivated over generations. 4 million enslaved people were free in law, but freedom in law is not the same as freedom secured in daily life. The same land remained. Much of the same white population remained. Many of the same local elites remained, wounded in pride and property, but not stripped of influence. The same fields still needed labor. The same courthouses still shaped local power. The same resentments, intensified now by defeat, continued breathing beneath the surface of peace. And so, Reconstruction began, though at first it did not fully know its own name. The federal government faced a problem unlike any it had encountered before. 11 states had claimed to leave the Union, formed a rival government, made war, and been defeated. What then was their status? Had they ever legally left the Union at all? If not, how should loyal governments be restored? Who should take the lead in setting the terms of that restoration? The President or Congress? What rights did the newly freed have? And who would protect them? Could former Confederates quickly resume political authority? Would Southern society simply reassemble itself in new form, minus the name slavery, but with as much of its substance as possible preserved? These were not technical questions. They were the future of the Republic. When Lincoln died, those questions became even more perilous. Andrew Johnson, his vice president, assumed the presidency. Johnson had been a Southern Unionist from Tennessee, a man who had remained loyal to the Union even when his state seceded. At first glance, this seemed like it might give him a particular moral authority in the defeated South. He knew the region. He had opposed secession. He spoke harshly at times about traitors and the planter class. Some hoped he might steer a firm course. But Johnson's understanding of freedom, race, and national reconstruction was far narrower and more troubled than the moment required. He was hostile to the old planter aristocracy in certain ways, yet deeply racist and profoundly unsuited to grasp the full meaning of emancipation. In the immediate aftermath of war, Johnson moved rapidly to restore the former Confederate states under comparatively lenient terms. He issued broad pardons, though requiring some wealthier ex-Confederates to apply personally. He allowed Southern states to form new governments once they repudiated secession, cancelled Confederate debts, and ratified the 13th Amendment. On the surface, this seemed to promise a quick reunion, but in practice, it opened the door for former Confederates and white Southern elites to return to power with alarming speed. The result was predictable and devastating. Across the South in 1865 and 1866, state governments passed what became known as the Black Codes. These laws varied by place, but their purpose was unmistakable: to control the labor, movement and independence of freed people, and to preserve as much of the old racial order as possible under a new legal name. Some laws restricted black mobility, penalized unemployment, or allowed authorities to bind black children into apprenticeships that could function as little more than coerced labor. Others limited occupations, testimony, or public rights. The old language of slavery had become impossible in law, but the old desire for domination had not softened. White Southern lawmakers were trying to rebuild mastery without the auction block, to keep black labor disciplined and cheap, and to deny that freedom meant full human independence. For freed people, this was both infuriating and clarifying. Emancipation had not ended struggle. It had changed the battlefield. The lives of formerly enslaved people in the first months and years after the war were marked by an extraordinary mixture of joy, uncertainty, initiative, grief, and determination. To be free after slavery was not merely to celebrate. It was to begin the work of building a life after generations in which life had been owned by others. Freed people sought first what slavery had most brutally denied them: family integrity. Husbands searched for wives sold away years earlier. Mothers searched for children. Brothers and sisters followed rumors across counties and states. Notices appeared in newspapers as people looked for loved ones lost through sale, flight, or war. The ache within those searches cannot be overstated. Slavery had broken families by law and commerce. Freedom began, for many, with trying to gather the broken pieces. Marriage itself held deep importance. Enslaved unions had possessed emotional and community reality, but not legal security. After emancipation, countless black couples formalized marriages in the eyes of church and state. This was not a small bureaucratic act. It was a declaration that their bonds would no longer exist at the whim of owners. It was dignity reclaimed in public form. Churches became central institutions in freed communities. Under slavery, black religious life had often been monitored, restricted, or forced into white-controlled structures. Freedom opened room for independent congregations, which quickly became places not only of worship, but of mutual aid, teaching, political organization, and communal identity. Schools also rose wherever possible. The hunger for literacy among freed people astonished even some sympathetic northern observers, though it should not have. To read had long been associated with danger and possibility under slavery. To learn letters after emancipation was to step toward a world from which one had been deliberately excluded. Children came to school. Adults came too, tired from labor, eager to master the written word that had so often been used against them. The Freedmen's Bureau, created in 1865, became one of the federal government's principal instruments for managing the transition from slavery to freedom. Its responsibilities were vast: assisting refugees, supervising labor arrangements, helping establish schools, providing some medical aid, supporting legal claims, and, in theory at least, helping protect freed people's rights. But the Bureau never had enough resources for the enormity of its task. Its agents were spread thin. Some were committed and courageous. Others were indifferent, paternalistic, or overwhelmed. The institution itself became a target of Southern hostility and Northern political division. Yet despite all its limitations, it represented something historically profound. The federal government, for one brief and imperfect period, accepting some responsibility for the transition from bondage to freedom. Labor became one of the central arenas of post-war conflict. Under slavery, labor had been coerced. Under freedom, formerly enslaved people wanted wages, time, autonomy, and some control over their families and movements. Many preferred to avoid gang labor and sought to organize work around family units. They wanted to decide when children worked, how women's labor was used, and whether Sundays and evenings belonged partly to themselves. Former slaveholders, by contrast, wanted a dependable labor force and often treated emancipation as an intolerable disruption to agricultural order. Out of this conflict emerged systems of sharecropping and tenant farming. In theory, such arrangements might offer flexibility. Landowners provided land, sometimes tools or seed, while labourers worked the crop in exchange for a share. In practice, especially over time, they often became traps of debt and dependency. Still, it is important not to flatten everything into inevitable disappointment. Freedom mattered. It mattered even when hemmed in, threatened, and exploited. The difference between slavery and sharecropping was not a minor one. A sharecropper could not be sold. A black family could not legally be owned. A freedman could, however precariously, try to bargain, move, worship independently, marry lawfully, educate his children, testify in some courts, claim wages, and imagine a future not built entirely on another man's command. The tragedy of Reconstruction is not that freedom meant nothing. It is that freedom meant so much, and yet was so fiercely resisted. In Washington, this resistance increasingly convinced many Northern Republicans that Johnson's lenient approach had failed. Radical Republicans and many moderates in Congress came to believe that presidential Reconstruction had allowed Southern white elites too much power too soon. They looked south and saw black codes, violence, unrepentant ex-Confederates, and Southern delegations to Congress that included men who had recently served the rebellion. They saw, In other words, that the old ruling class was trying to return wearing altered clothes. And they concluded that if the fruits of Union victory were to be preserved, Congress would have to take a much stronger hand. Out of that conflict came one of the great constitutional and political struggles in American history. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, declaring all persons born in the United States, except most Native Americans under separate sovereign nations at the time, to be citizens and affirming basic civil rights. Johnson vetoed it. Congress overrode his veto. The significance of that moment was enormous. It showed not only a clash of personalities, but a contest over the meaning of citizenship after slavery. Was freedom simply the absence of ownership, or did it require protection in law against state and private oppression? Congress was moving toward the latter answer. The 14th Amendment followed, and with it came another decisive transformation. It established birthright citizenship, required states to provide due process and equal protection of the laws, and sought to prevent former Confederate elites from easily reclaiming power. Like the 13th Amendment, its meaning would stretch far beyond the immediate post-war years. But in its own time, it addressed the central post-war crisis. Could Southern states be trusted to define rights for freed people on their own? Congress's answer, increasingly, was no. The Constitution itself had to be changed to bind the Republic to a deeper definition of citizenship. Johnson resisted this course bitterly. He vetoed legislation, denounced congressional measures, and embarked on a disastrous speaking tour that only weakened his standing. The political atmosphere became poisonous. Congress responded with Reconstruction Acts in 1867, placing the South under military districts and requiring new state constitutions with black male suffrage as a condition for readmission. This was a turning point. The federal government now embraced, however unevenly, a more radical reconstruction of Southern politics. The question was no longer merely whether the Southern states would return. It was on what terms, and with whose voices included. For a brief period, the possibilities were extraordinary. Black men voted and held office in significant numbers during Reconstruction. They served in constitutional conventions, state legislatures, and Congress. This was one of the great democratic experiments in American history and one of the most contested. Formerly enslaved men and free black men, long denied power, now entered public life in a region where only years earlier many of them could not legally testify against a white man, travel freely, or keep their families secure from sale. Their political participation was not symbolic. It shaped law, schooling, public works, and the very meaning of Southern democracy. White Southern reaction to this was furious. The defeat of the Confederacy had been bitter enough. The destruction of slavery had been worse. But the sight of black men voting, serving on juries, holding office, and helping govern Southern states struck at the heart of white supremacist assumptions. Out of this fury came terrorism. The Ku Klux Klan, founded in 1865, was the most notorious of several white supremacist paramilitary movements that emerged in the Reconstruction South. Cloaked in secrecy and ritual, its purpose was direct and violent: to restore white dominance through intimidation, assault, murder, and political terror. Black voters, black office holders, white Republican allies, teachers, ministers, and local leaders became targets. Homes were invaded. People were beaten, whipped, shot, and lynched. The Klan and similar groups were not accidents of social disorder. They were counter-revolutionary forces. If the Civil War had destroyed slavery by force of arms, these groups meant to defeat freedom by force of fear. Federal action against this violence eventually came, especially under President Ulysses S. Grant, who succeeded Johnson in 1869. Enforcement acts in the early 1870s gave the federal government greater power to suppress Klan terror and protect voting rights. In some areas, these measures had real effect. Arrests were made, networks were disrupted. For a time, federal authority pushed back. But the deeper problem remained. Could the North sustain the will to protect black freedom over the long haul, especially as the memory of war receded and other concerns took hold? This is where the story of Reconstruction becomes especially painful, because it is a story of both brilliance and abandonment. Schools were founded, constitutions rewritten, political participation widened, public institutions expanded, families stabilized themselves under freedom as best they could. Black communities built churches, businesses, newspapers, lodges, and civic life under astonishingly difficult conditions. Yet all the while, white resistance adapted, violence continued, economic coercion deepened, Northern commitment weakened, and the old temptation reappeared. Reconciliation between whites, North and South, purchased at the cost of black rights. Meanwhile, memory itself was becoming contested terrain. Even before Reconstruction had fully unfolded, some white Southerners were already beginning to reinterpret the war in ways that would later harden into what became known as the lost cause tradition. In that telling, the Confederacy became noble, gallant, and tragic, fighting not primarily for slavery but for abstract liberty, local self-government, or constitutional principle. Enslaved people were sentimentalized as loyal dependents. Slavery itself was softened, excused, or pushed to the edges of the story. This was not simply bad history, it was political work. By recasting the war, former Confederates and their sympathizers could defend honor, justify white supremacy, and resist the new meaning of the Union victory. The battle over memory was inseparable from the battle over power. For Black Americans, memory was different. The war had meant emancipation, military service, family reunion, churches, schools, voting, and the first real opening of citizenship. It had also meant betrayal, violence, and the urgent knowledge that rights not defended could be rights stolen back. These competing memories of the Civil War and its aftermath would shape American life for generations. By the early 1870s, the country stood at a crossroads. The Constitution had been transformed, slavery was abolished, citizenship had been redefined. Black men voted and served in government, yet white terror remained real, and Northern weariness was growing. The question that had once been whether a nation half slave and half free could endure had now become another kind of question. Could a nation that had abolished slavery also enforce freedom against organized white resistance? Could military victory be translated into social justice? Could law reach far enough into local life to protect those whom slavery had most deeply exposed? The answer had not yet been decided. The answer, in the end, was yes in law, but not fully in life. That is one of the most painful truths in the story of the Civil War and its aftermath. The Union had won. The Confederacy had been destroyed. Slavery had been abolished by constitutional amendment. Citizenship had been redefined. Voting rights for black men had been protected in the 15th Amendment. On paper, the revolution was enormous. A nation built in compromise with bondage had formally cut slavery out of its body, and for a time had tried to build a democracy wider than any it had previously known. And yet a country can write justice into law and still fail to defend it. By the early 1870s, Reconstruction had already entered its most fragile phase. The achievements were real. That matters and must never be forgotten. Black political participation in the South was unprecedented. Black legislators served in state governments and in Congress. Public education expanded. New state constitutions were written. The federal government had, for a moment, accepted the duty of protecting civil and political rights against local white resistance. For millions of formerly enslaved people, life after emancipation remained hard. But it was not slavery. Families existed in law. Churches flourished. Schools multiplied. Communities developed under freedom. And that freedom had substance even when besieged. But opposition to Reconstruction never softened into mere resentment. It organized. White supremacist violence became one of the defining facts of the post-war South. The Ku Klux Klan was only the most famous of several such organizations. White League groups, red shirts, rifle clubs, and local vigilantes all participated in campaigns of intimidation meant to restore white political dominance. Their methods were direct and often public. They murdered political organizers, whipped laborers, attacked black schools and churches, threatened families, and targeted elections with calculated terror. They did not need to kill everyone. They only needed to make political participation dangerous enough that it became difficult to sustain. Violence and the threat of violence did what speeches alone could not. They broke confidence, scattered meetings, silenced witnesses, and reminded black Southerners that freedom without protection could become a field of constant exposure. Some Northerners understood this clearly and wanted federal power used more aggressively. Others began to grow tired. The emotional and political stamina needed to defend Reconstruction year after year was difficult to maintain, especially as the war receded into memory for people whose homes had not been battlegrounds. Economic questions reasserted themselves. Corruption scandals in national politics damaged the moral standing of Republican administrations. Democratic critics denounced federal intervention in the South as tyranny or partisan manipulation. Even some Northerners who had supported emancipation began to slide into the comfortable fantasy that the South could work out its problems on its own, if only sectional bitterness would fade. But the South was not suffering from excessive bitterness in the abstract. It was suffering from a determined white campaign to nullify black freedom in practice. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, declared that the right to vote could not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This was another monumental change. It extended the logic of Reconstruction further into the democratic structure of the Republic. But as with earlier gains, the amendment required enforcement, and enforcement required political will. A constitutional promise means little if county officials ignore it, if armed men wait outside polling places, if judges refuse to punish intimidation, and if state governments are captured by those hostile to the promise itself. Reconstruction's central tragedy was not a lack of principles. It was the weakening of the force required to defend them. President Ulysses S. Grant, for all his flaws, did at times use federal power against white terror. The Enforcement Acts and other measures enabled intervention against Klan violence. And in some areas, these actions disrupted white supremacist organizations significantly. But suppression was uneven, temporary, and often politically costly. The federal government could strike hard in one place and then relax in another. It could arrest, prosecute, and patrol, but unless the larger northern electorate remained committed, the force behind those actions would diminish. White supremacists understood this. They did not need to win one dramatic national battle. They needed only to outlast federal resolve and reclaim power state by state, county by county, courthouse by courthouse. Economics also weighed heavily on freedom. After the war, many formerly enslaved people had hoped for land. The phrase, 40 acres and a mule, though never realized as general national policy, expressed something deeper than rumor. It expressed the belief that freedom required an economic foundation. To be free while landless in a countryside, still dominated by former slaveholders, was to remain vulnerable. Without land of their own, many freed people entered labor arrangements that placed them in cycles of debt and dependence. Sharecropping spread across the South as a compromise between planters who needed labor and freed people who wanted more autonomy than gang labor allowed. But the crop lien system, credit manipulation, unpredictable markets, and unequal bargaining power often trapped black and poor white farmers alike in a pattern of chronic indebtedness. This was not slavery, but neither was it genuine economic independence. The persistence of white poverty in the South complicates the picture without softening its racial core. Many white Southerners were also trapped in debt, agricultural weakness, and elite domination. But whiteness still carried political and social privileges that black freedom did not erase. Poor whites could be enlisted into white supremacy by promising them status, control, and racial solidarity, even when the economic order did not serve them well. This was one of the enduring engines of Southern politics after the war. Class grievances were repeatedly redirected into racial hierarchy, allowing local elites and political leaders to rebuild power through division. By the mid-1870s, the political atmosphere in the North had changed further. The Panic of 1873 triggered a severe economic depression, shifting public attention toward financial instability, unemployment, and business failure. Reconstruction began to seem to many voters like a distant, endless, and exhausting responsibility. The old moral urgency that had animated the war years and early Emancipation era weakened under recession, scandal, fatigue, and the seductive appeal of normalcy. White Southerners who resisted Reconstruction recognized the opportunity. They increasingly described themselves as redeemers, as though they were rescuing their states from corruption and misrule, when in fact they were aiming to restore white dominance and curtail black citizenship. This redemption was not peaceful in any innocent sense. It came through elections, yes, but elections conducted under intimidation, fraud, and uneven protection. It came through rifle clubs and paramilitary marches. It came through massacres. In places like Colfax, Louisiana, in 1873, white supremacist violence revealed with horrifying clarity how determined many were to destroy biracial democracy. The events varied from state to state, but the pattern was consistent. Whenever black political participation and Republican state power seemed strong enough to matter, organized white violence rose to meet them. The Supreme Court also played a role in narrowing Reconstruction's promise. Decisions in the 1870s restricted the reach of federal protections, interpreting the new amendments in ways that limited national power and left much civil rights enforcement to the states themselves. This was devastating because the states most in need of federal correction were often the least willing to protect black citizens. Law, which had seemed to offer a powerful shield, became less reliable as the court drew boundaries around federal authority. Then came the disputed presidential election of 1876, one of the most consequential in American history. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel J. Tilden contested results in several southern states amid widespread conflict and accusation. The crisis was resolved not simply by abstract constitutional purity, but through political bargaining. Out of that struggle came what is often remembered as the Compromise of 1877. Its exact mechanics were more complicated than a single secret meeting in a closed room, but the outcome was clear enough. Hayes became president, and federal troops were withdrawn from the remaining occupied southern states, where Reconstruction governments still depended on military support. With that withdrawal, Reconstruction as a sustained federal project effectively ended. This did not mean every black officeholder vanished overnight, or that every constitutional gain immediately dissolved. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments remained. Black communities remained. Schools, churches, families, and memories remained. But the era in which the federal government had shown a serious willingness, however inconsistent, to use power in defense of Southern black citizenship had largely closed, and white Southern elites, along with their allies, moved quickly to consolidate control. What followed is sometimes described too gently as a retreat from Reconstruction, as though it were a matter of shifting interest or evolving interpretation. In reality, it was a surrender of protection. The nation had fought a vast war over slavery and union, rewritten its constitution, and briefly opened democracy in radical ways, only to step back and allow those gains to be undermined in practice by those who'd opposed them most fiercely. This was not complete defeat, because emancipation itself could not be reversed in law. Slavery did not return as chattel bondage. That matters decisively. But many of the broader possibilities of Reconstruction were abandoned. From that abandonment emerged the long regime later known as Jim Crow. In the decades that followed, Southern states erected a system of racial segregation, disenfranchisement, labor exploitation, and legal inequality that, while different from slavery, rested on many of the same assumptions about race and power. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, white primaries, segregated rail cars and schools, anti-miscegenation laws, convict leasing and racial terror became part of the architecture of this new order. Lynching became one of its most visible instruments of social enforcement, a public ritual of domination meant to remind black communities that even freedom in law did not guarantee safety in life. What the Civil War had destroyed in one form, white supremacy rebuilt in another. And yet, even here, one must resist telling the story as though Black Americans simply disappeared beneath oppression. They did not. They built lives, institutions, businesses, schools, newspapers, fraternal societies, and political movements under conditions of immense danger. They migrated when movement offered hope. They litigated, organized, preached, taught, farmed, created, and remembered. Reconstruction had shown what freedom might be. Jim Crow would show how fiercely that freedom could be contained, but never fully extinguished. The struggle would continue into the 20th century and beyond. So what then had the Civil War accomplished if its promises were later betrayed in so many ways? It had destroyed slavery, and that alone changed the moral structure of the nation forever. It had preserved the Union, proving that secession would not triumph by force. It had expanded federal power and altered the Constitution in ways that later generations would use to press new claims for justice. It had made Black citizenship and Black military service part of the national story in irreversible ways. It had shown, at immense human cost, that the Republic could not survive half slave and half free. And it had also revealed something darker, that even when a nation fights a bloody war to destroy one form of oppression, it may still lack the courage or consistency to destroy the hierarchy beneath it. This is why the Civil War never really ended as a matter of memory and meaning. It became not just an event in the past, but a continuing argument about what America is. Was the war fundamentally about union or slavery, or both? Was Reconstruction a noble attempt at democracy or a humiliating imposition, as white supremacist myth later claimed? Who counted as a citizen? What did freedom require? How much power should the federal government use to protect rights? These questions did not stay in the 19th century. They kept returning because the Civil War had forced the nation to confront them without ever fully finishing the work. The country that emerged from Reconstruction was not the same country that had entered secession in 1860. It had been bloodied, enlarged, chastened, and morally exposed. It had become more democratic in principle and more unequal in practice. It had cut slavery out of law, but had not cut white supremacy out of society. It had proven that constitutional transformation was possible, and also that constitutional transformation could be weakened by political exhaustion. It had produced heroes, martyrs, opportunists, terrorists, reformers, and survivors. And in every decade after, Americans would go on arguing over which of those figures most truly represented the nation. By the end of the 1870s, the Civil War's battlefield phase was long over, but its consequences were still unfolding everywhere. In Southern courthouses, in Northern politics, in family memory, in Black schools, in white supremacist violence, in constitutional law, in veterans' reunions, in monuments yet to be raised, in textbooks yet to be written, in songs and speeches and silences. The war had ended. The struggle over its meaning had not. In the end, the Civil War became more than a war. It began as a crisis over Union and secession, over political power and constitutional claims, over whether slaveholding states would remain inside a republic they believed was turning against them. But beneath those arguments, and ultimately inside all of them, lay the deeper truth that had been there from the beginning. The war came because slavery had been allowed to grow into the center of national life, and because the United States had for too long tried to live with a contradiction that could not be made permanent. A nation that spoke of liberty while holding millions in bondage had carried a wound from its birth. The Civil War was the moment that wound split open. To look back across the whole story is to see how long the conflict had been preparing itself before armies ever marched. It was there in the Constitution's compromises, in the expansion of cotton, in the sale of human beings downriver, in the rise of abolitionism, in the fury over fugitive slaves, in Kansas, in court rulings, in elections, in sermons, in plantation discipline, in the silence of those who benefited and the voices of those who resisted. Then came secession, then war, then the killing fields, then emancipation, then black enlistment, then the collapse of the Confederacy, then the unfinished struggle to define freedom after slavery. Each phase seemed at times to open into something new, yet all of it remained connected by the same central question: who counted as fully human in the American Republic, and what would the nation do once it could no longer avoid answering? For 4 years of fighting, that answer was written in blood. The dead were everywhere by the end. They lay beneath grand memorial speeches and beneath nameless boards. They lay in national cemeteries and family plots, in places where markers stood, and places where no one ever came back to mark them properly. They had died in the wilderness and at Antietam, at Gettysburg and Shiloh, at Vicksburg and Cold Harbor, in prison camps, on hospital cots, under infection, under artillery, under flags they believed meant something worth giving their lives for. The scale of death changed the country forever. There are losses so great that they alter not only politics, but the emotional weather of a people. The Civil War did that. It taught Americans the cost of the question they had delayed too long. And still, within all that death, there was also a kind of birth. That is one of the reasons the war continues to matter with such force. It destroyed something ancient and monstrous on American soil. Slavery, which had been defended as property, custom, necessity, religion, economy, and racial order, was broken by the war and abolished in law. That was not a small reform. It was a revolutionary transformation. 4 million people emerged from legal bondage. Families once at the mercy of sale could now claim themselves openly. Black men entered the army and the electorate. Churches and schools rose where whips and auctioneers had once ruled. The Constitution itself was remade. However partial, however resisted, however later betrayed in practice, that remaking cannot be undone in the moral record. The United States that came out of the war was not the United States that had gone in. And yet the war also left behind a warning that history has not allowed the country to forget. Winning a war against slavery did not mean winning a final victory against white supremacy. Abolishing bondage did not automatically create equality. Freedom had to be protected, expanded, enforced, and renewed. And too often the nation faltered in that duty. Reconstruction opened possibilities as bold as any in American history, and then many of those possibilities were narrowed, attacked, or abandoned. The old slave society did not simply disappear, it adapted, resisted, and reasserted itself in new forms. The story of the Civil War, then, is not comforting in any simple way. It offers no easy assurance that moral progress, once achieved, will carry itself forward. It shows instead that justice won at enormous cost can still be weakened by fatigue, fear, myth, and political surrender. That is why memory matters so much here. For generations, Americans argued over what the war had been about. Some tried to recast it as a noble quarrel of abstract principles, blurring slavery into the margins so that the Confederacy might appear tragic without appearing guilty. Others insisted correctly that slavery was central, that without slavery there is no secession, and without secession, no civil war. These memory battles were never only academic. They shaped monuments, textbooks, holidays, politics, and the emotional inheritance passed from one generation to the next. To remember the war honestly is to refuse the comfort of false innocence. It is to say that the nation nearly destroyed itself over slavery, and that the men and women who lived through that destruction forced the country into a more truthful reckoning with its own ideals. But history is not only made of governments and declarations, it is also made of human interiors. It is made of an enslaved mother hearing, perhaps by rumor at first, that freedom may be coming and not yet daring to believe it. It is made of a Union soldier writing home from mud and smoke, trying to sound braver than he feels. It is made of a Confederate widow standing in a doorway after the surrender, looking at a road that will not bring back what she has lost. It is made of a black veteran wearing federal blue into a southern town, where only a few years earlier he might have been hunted as property. It is made of children in the first free schools, shaping letters with hands their parents had once been forbidden to teach. It is made of a president, worn with grief, speaking of charity at the edge of victory, and then dying before he could shape the peace. It is made of people who had no power to make policy, and yet lived every consequence of it in their bodies and homes. That is why the story endures. It is not only the story of armies and amendments, it is the story of what happens when a nation built on principles confronts the cost of betraying them. By the time the war and its first aftermath had passed, the United States had been transformed in at least three permanent ways. First, the Union was no longer a loose experiment that might at any moment dissolve by state decision. The war settled, through force, that the Republic was indivisible. Second, slavery was abolished, and with it, the legal right to own another human life as chattel. Third, the federal government emerged with a different relationship to liberty, citizenship, and national power than it had possessed before the war. These changes shaped everything that followed. Later struggles for civil rights, voting rights, equal protection, and national belonging all drew strength, directly or indirectly, from the constitutional and moral revolution the Civil War had set in motion. And still, even with all that, the war's ending was never simple enough to allow pure triumph. There was too much loss for that. Too much unfinished work. Too much grief folded into victory. The Union survived, but hundreds of thousands had died. Slavery ended, but racism did not. Freedom came, but not with land, safety, or full equality guaranteed. The Confederate rebellion was defeated, but the myths built around it would continue poisoning memory long after the armies were gone. The nation had answered one terrible question and inherited many others. In that sense, The Civil War closed an era and opened one at the same time. Perhaps that is the smoothest way to understand its ending, not as a door shutting, but as a threshold crossed. On one side of that threshold stood the old America, slaveholding, divided, half bound to a republic it could never fully reconcile with bondage. On the other side stood a different America, bloodied and unfinished, more honest in law, more contested in practice, and newly burdened with the task of becoming worthy of the freedom it had finally begun to define more clearly. The war carried the nation across that threshold, but it did not complete the journey. No war ever could. So when we speak of the Civil War as a story of slavery, freedom, and division between North and South, we are speaking not only of a sequence of events, but of a long human drama about contradiction and change. We are speaking of a country that tried to delay a moral reckoning until delay itself became impossible. We are speaking of millions who endured, resisted, fought, died, mourned, rebuilt, and remembered. We are speaking of a war that settled some questions forever and left others echoing into the future. And if there is any final stillness to be found at the end of this long story, it may be this. The Civil War proved that the United States could survive its greatest internal rupture, but only by being changed by it. The nation that emerged carried scars that never fully faded. It also carried a deeper knowledge of what freedom required and how costly it could be to deny it. The smoke lifted, the armies went home, the graves remained, and the country moved forward, altered, chastened, and unfinished. And there, at last, the story comes to rest. Thank you for being here with me tonight, and for letting this story carry you through the darkness and into the quiet. The Civil War is one of those chapters of history that lingers long after the last page is turned. A story of pain, courage, division, and the long, unfinished search for freedom. And tonight, we've walked through it together, slowly, one step at a time. Now, as this story comes to rest, let your thoughts soften. Let the voices of history grow distant. Let the battlefields fade, the smoke clear, and the world become still again. If you're still awake, leave me a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. And if you found peace, comfort, or company in this story, don't forget to subscribe. More than 90% of you who listen are not subscribed, and subscribing truly helps support the channel and motivates me to keep making more long, immersive stories for sleep. For now, close your eyes, settle deeper into your pillow, and allow yourself to drift. Good night, and I'll see you in the next story.